Italian Billionaire's Determined Lover. The Romano Brothers Series, Book 3. Written by Leslie North. Read by Connor Brown. Chapter 1. Leonardo. The sound of hammers, saws, and occasional drills echoed down the hall and into the suite of rooms that Leonardo Romano had taken over as his temporary office within the Romano del Mare. Structural repairs on the 870-year-old monastery-turned-resort were nearing completion. Now it was Leonardo's turn to apply his personal mastery to prepare the old place to once more accept vacationers. They would walk through its halls and find luxurious sanctuary within private suites, and everything they ate, touched, smelled, and much of what they saw would be due to Leonardo's vision of what an amazing resort experience should be. At least that's how Leonardo had intended it, but matters were being pulled out of his control. "Just sign right here," Mr. Panucci said, sparking a depth of annoyance within Leonardo he rarely felt about anyone. Leonardo knew that the situation that he'd found himself in wasn't Mr. Panucci's fault. Regardless, having to allow a design firm other than his own to oversee the sculpting of the resort's very personality didn't sit well with Leonardo, and he rankled when Mr. Panucci's voice invaded his ears once more. "I know you are going to love the design plan that we have come up with." Leonardo fought down his contempt for the man, but the truth was it didn't matter who was standing in front of him with pen in hand and a host of ideas in his or her head. They weren't Leonardo's ideas, and he didn't like not being in control. Ever. "All major decisions will continue to go through me for final approval?" Leonardo asked unnecessarily. The stipulation had already been stressed repeatedly. "Yes, sir, of course," Mr. Panucci quickly assured, smiling. "Show me where it says it in the contract." Leonardo had already read the contract and knew what it said. His lawyers had read the contract and knew what it said. Regardless, he needed to see that he had final approval in black and white within the document he was about to sign before he put ink to paper. Mr. Panucci's smile fell as his gaze dropped to the 15-page contract sitting on the heavy, ornate, antique table that Leonardo was using as a desk. He stuttered on the words as he said, "Yes, sir." Yet he went to work searching for the section, bending low over the desk as he flipped through the document's pages. A familiar tension crept into Leonardo's muscles, and he took a deep, calming breath as he shifted his attention out the 6-foot-tall window that provided natural light to the room. It overlooked an area of the resort's property that sloped upward toward cliffs that overlooked the Ionian Sea. There was a path of in-ground stepping stones leading up toward the cliff's edge, and near the top was a newly constructed pool to provide the resort's someday patrons the opportunity to swim in a controlled environment rather than the sea. His brother, Jean-Pierre, had fought him on the addition of a modern pool amid the trappings of the ancient monastery, saying that the pool's build was too out of sync with the rest of the architecture. But Leonardo had moved forward with it anyway. The architectural authenticity of the resort came second to the potential enjoyment of the resort's guests. Leonardo swiveled his chair away from the desk and squinted as he leaned forward with his elbows resting on his knees. Walking along the farthest edge of the pool was a woman wearing a light-colored wispy dress that covered her entire frame, from her neck to her ankles. The wind had the dress contoured to her slender frame, yet, despite the quick breeze, only a few loose strands of her hair moved. The rest was woven into a braid that traveled down the side of her head to end in a messy bun at the nape of her neck. Draped around her neck and stretching behind her, a sheer scarf fluttered in the wind. She was beyond beautiful. She was haunting, and Leonardo did his best to emblazon the image of her on his mind. As he watched, the woman went to the banister that separated the pool area from the cliff's edge and hoisted herself up on it with straight arms, leaving the tips of her toes dangling several inches above the ground. There, she craned her neck and leaned forward slightly, as if trying to get a better view past the cliff's edge. Leonardo's palms itched to reach out to her, to pull her back from the teetering edge. But another part of him wanted to join her, to embrace the same sense of freedom she appeared to feel. As it was, he felt trapped under a million decisions, and no matter where he was, there was no escaping them. "It's right here, sir," Mr. Panucci said, taking the document from the table to put it beneath Leonardo's nose. So it is, Leonardo said, with more than a little bit of resignation, as he studied the part that the design firm's liaison pointed out. Glancing back up, Leonardo searched for the woman he'd been watching, but she was gone. It was just as well. The Romano del Mare was still under renovation, and visitors wandering around the property wouldn't do. The woman had no business being where she'd been, and he would have to send someone to tell her to leave if she hadn't left on her own. Swiveling his chair to face the table again, Leonardo pushed away the unease he felt in his stomach. It was an indistinct worry that he hadn't been able to put a name to. But it didn't matter now. There was a plan. Everything between Romano Industries and Gallant Industries, the design firm Mr. Panucci represented, had been worked out. All that was left for him was to sign the contract. Picking up his Bentley fountain pen, Leonardo pushed aside his growing unease and scratched his name on the contract's last page with a decisive flourish. That was more show than an indicator of how he was feeling. He was signing away too much of his control over the design directions that would be taken with the Romano del Mare, as she was ready to receive the first customers she'd seen in decades. He'd personally overseen the launch and relaunch of hundreds of spas and resorts and had built a chain of Romano hotels that spanned the globe. All of the Romano hotels were decorated with 4- and 5-star rankings. And it did not sit well with him that the design launch of the Romano del Mare, the iconic flagship resort of the Romano fortune, was being put into someone else's hands. But Leonardo didn't have a choice. He was contractually obligated to work with Gallant Industries on this project because of an ongoing business agreement that he'd been pressured into in overseeing the launch of another international hotel chain. The truth was, though, that going with Gallant Industries' design and PR firm would provide for the most lucrative launch in this situation, and that was what mattered most. Just because the Romano del Mare was the most unique, oldest, and longest-owned property of the Romano family didn't mean that it shouldn't be handled with the same eye toward operation costs versus potential earnings. At the end of the day, it was no different than any other Romano property, and if it couldn't pay for itself, then it had no business being among the Romano family holdings. "Mr. Romano," Mr. Panucci gushed, as Leonardo put down the pen and slowly stood. "This is an exciting day for both your company and Gallant Industries." The man grabbed Leonardo's hand with both of his and pumped it in a vigorous handshake. "It is," Leonardo responded graciously, extracting his hand from Mr. Panucci's grip and patting him on the shoulder. It was a lie, of course. It wasn't an exciting day. It was an uncomfortable day, within which he'd given someone more power over an outcome that actually mattered to him. It was, in fact, a terrible day that made him want to seek out something to take for the acid that ate at his stomach. Movement near the door caught his attention from the corner of his eye, and he turned away from Mr. Panucci's over-eager smile to find the woman who had been standing near the cliffs. She now stood in the doorway of his office, and she was no less a vision up close than she had been on the windswept cliff tops. She smiled, and Leonardo's heart all but stopped. Mr. Panucci's voice faded away, and Leonardo released his hold on the man's shoulder to walk halfway across the room. A part of him thought she might disappear again, like an ethereal being whose time on Earth was only momentary. And another part of him knew she was only a woman who was someplace she wasn't supposed to be. Pulling in a breath, Leonardo prepared to tell her that she had to go, but his words were forgotten when she spoke instead. "Mr. Romano, I'm Stella Brown. I've been sent by the International Preservation Society to enforce preservation laws and to direct you on how to rewrite your renovation plans." Chapter 2. Stella. "Mr. Romano?" The handsome man's slack face was a sure sign of his incomprehension at what Stella had said. He was tall with shoulders so wide that she wouldn't have been able to wrap her arms around him and touch her hands behind his back. His black hair was thick with a natural curl that made her fingers tingle with the desire to play in it. But most of all, she wanted to trace the little widow's peak on his forehead. She bit her inner lip. She was sure that she'd seen him on the cover of some fashion magazine. Men who looked like he did were like unicorns. They didn't actually exist in nature. She blinked, half expecting him to morph into something a foot shorter, 50 pounds heavier, and 20 years older. But when she opened her eyes again, he was every bit as devastatingly handsome as he had been before. It wasn't fair. Men weren't supposed to look like him in real life. It made it hard to think, and Stella's job was on the line. She had to stay focused. She had to get this right. If she failed to make the owners of the Romano del Mare toe the line with regard to maintaining the integrity of such an important example of medieval architecture as the Romano del Mare, she would be out of a job. It was as simple as that. And her job was important to her. "Scusi?" Leonardo asked, stopping half the way to her with his brows arched high enough to crinkle his forehead. "I'm Stella," she said, and then added, "Stella Brown," when Leonardo's expression didn't change. He didn't seem to recognize her, but she knew him. She'd thoroughly researched the talented Billionaire Romano brothers, co-owners of the Romano del Mare, before making her trip halfway across the globe. She'd seen Leonardo's picture online, but the grainy photographs hadn't done him justice. The eldest Romano brother looked like an Italian movie star, and Stella had to fight against her desire to simply stare at him like a dreamy-eyed schoolgirl. Finally, when Leonardo didn't move, Stella charged forward with her hand extended in preparation for a handshake. But her long, sure gait fumbled when she tripped and fell headlong out of control, only to end up in Leonardo's incredibly strong arms, leaning over as if he had dipped her for a kiss. It was humiliating, to say the least, but feeling his long arms wrapped around her, she didn't care. Instead, she reveled in it, embraced it. It was the moment she was in, and she would enjoy the pleasures it had to offer rather than wallow in the negative haze of her own perceptions making. Swallowing, she did her best to refocus. She still had a job to do. "I emailed you," she said, as both a question and a statement, staring up into his unbelievably blue eyes. She could lose herself in those eyes. Without her permission, her hand reached up to touch a finger to the tip of Leonardo's widow's peak. She wanted to do more. She wanted to trace the contours of his face, but she knew that she needed to behave. Her no-holds-barred zest for life wasn't within everybody's comfort zone, and she didn't want to alienate the man she would have to work closely with over the next several months. Leonardo blinked, but continued to hold her as she was, tilted backwards in his arms, until finally Stella offered up her hand between them for a handshake. "Stella Brown, it's wonderful to meet you." That appeared to break the confused spell that Leonardo had apparently been lost in, and Stella was put upright on her feet. He moved her body with the same ease as moving curtains, and his strength made her body want to go limp so that she could melt into his embrace. But she forced herself to stand tall, strong, and on her own when his arms left her, and he stepped away. "I'm sorry. There seems to be confusion. The resort is not yet open to receive visitors, and I must sadly ask you to leave. It is for your own safety, I assure you. The final renovations are still in progress. It would not do to have people wandering around the property before we open our doors to the public." "Public? No. I'm Stella Brown. I emailed." She couldn't believe she was having to go through all of this again. To say that she had emailed him was a bit of an understatement. She'd sent a barrage of communications, each one with a more intense and direct message than the last. She was coming. All renovations needed to cease, and she would assist them in the creation of new renovation plans which would adhere to the laws regarding the restoration of protected ruins. Okay, so it was true that she'd never heard back from them. That wasn't unusual. The owners of historic sites rarely welcomed her organization's input with open arms. But despite that, the law was on her side, and she would be fierce in her efforts to make the Romano brothers abide by them. Stella's body felt energized from head to toe, as if ready to zoom into action, but she wasn't going to fool herself. Getting the Romano brothers to comply with the International Preservation Society's vision for the Romano del Mare wouldn't be easy. In fact, it would be an all-out battle. But she was ready for it. She would get them to see things her way. "Bianca?" Leonardo called out as his gaze stayed locked on Stella. His look was that of someone staring at a madwoman, no longer in touch with reality. "Bianca!" Stella heard the click-clack of high heels and turned to see a young woman walk in the door of Leonardo's office. She was all curves and had near black hair with glints of red highlights. Her complexion was flawless, and she wore a pencil skirt that hugged her round hips and accentuated her slim waist. To Stella's surprise and embarrassment, she felt her cheeks heat. There was no way that a man as amazingly talented and gorgeous as Leonardo Romano could be around a woman who looked like her and not get involved. Standing so near her, Stella suddenly felt inadequate and all but invisible. "Bianca," Leonardo said, as he clapped his hands together. Relief, as if he were being rescued, was clear in his face and voice. "This is—" He glanced at her, as if having to search his short-term memory for her name, and his pause brought even more heat to Stella's cheeks. "Stella Brown," he said with a rush, and a little too loudly, as if compensating for not having remembered it right away. "Have you gotten any emails from her?" "No," the young woman said, shaking her head. Then her eyes flew wide. "Oh!" She pointed a finger at Stella. "But those emails were spam. Exclamation marks everywhere. They had to be spam." That sealed it. Stella was now so mortified that she wanted to crawl under a rock. Turning away from Bianca, she returned her attention to Leonardo and found that he was already looking at her. She smiled, but even she could tell that it was weak and strained. "Yes, she cleared her throat. She knew she had to get it together. This moment was her best shot at impressing upon them that they had to listen to her. She was a representative, being provided to them to guide them through historic preservation laws. They needed her if they wanted to avoid heavy sanctions that would make the resort unprofitable for years to come. "Those emails were from me," she said, straightening her shoulders and standing up a little taller. "I apologize for any confusion. It was just that the message I was relaying was of extreme importance. You must cease all renovation efforts at once. Your restoration plans will be reviewed by me, and I will assist you in altering them in whatever manner necessary to keep you in compliance with the laws that govern the restoration of such heritage sites as this medieval monastery." Stella stopped speaking long enough to give Leonardo a chance to ask some questions or at least say something. But instead, he stood as still as a statue and continued to look at her like she was an alien from outer space. Stella swallowed hard before continuing. "The crown molding and drywall that has been constructed in various areas of the monastery will need to be torn out. The pool near the cliffs will need to be filled in and the banister removed." Taking a deep breath, she forged on, despite Leonardo's open look of dismay. "Everything about the monastery will need to be restored back to its most basic elements." She steeled herself. "And the property will need to be maintained for minimal public viewing, with only parts of it available for use as a resort." Silence hung in the air when she'd finished talking. It lingered for at least 5 seconds, until finally it was shattered by Leonardo bursting out in laughter. "Adeline, Nicolo's fiancée, she put you up to this, didn't she? You are one of her American friends." He was smiling from ear to ear, and the corners of his eyes crinkled, showing his age like a fine wine that just gets better and better. Stella looked behind her where Bianca had disappeared, wondering if someone new had entered the room to make Leonardo think that she was trying to fool him. But the doorway was empty. She looked back at Leonardo. "Who's Adeline?" Leonardo's laughter stopped, and Stella gave him a forced smile, suddenly wary of the adversary in front of her. Judging by the look on his face, this was going to be her toughest project yet. Chapter 3. Leonardo. Leonardo rubbed his tired eyes as he rested his elbows on the desk at his office. It had been 2 days since his surprise meeting from Stella Brown, and he'd barely managed to get 4 hours of sleep during that time. Last night had been another long night of international phone calls with half a dozen lawyers. The first question, had they broken any preservation laws, had been answered after hours of his lawyers arguing with 3 different preservation specialists, and the answer was a resounding yes, so loud that it could have reverberated off the walls. "Damn it," he swore under his breath. He had to figure out a way through the mire he'd found himself and his brothers in. If a workaround couldn't be identified and exploited, they would be out several million euros. Not only would they be out of pocket for the renovation costs to date, but they would have no way to recoup the loss or even sell the property. No one would be willing to buy it. Furthermore, the iconic property, which had once been a favorite vacationing spot known the world over, would never again open her doors to tourists as a resort. Not under Stella's vision. There was absolutely no way that he would move forward with a plan that involved opening only small portions of the monastery for use as a resort. It was all or nothing. The expense of the remodeling was too cost-prohibitive otherwise. No matter how he looked at it, the Preservation Society had them trapped in a lose-lose situation, and he had to figure a way out. Leonardo opened his eyes and reached for the rolled papers that sat at the edge of his desk. Opening them up and smoothing them out, he stared at them with a practiced eye. They were Stella's plans for the Romano del Mare's final restoration, and to his great annoyance, they were good. Very good. But they would be costly to implement on multiple levels. He had already signed with Gallant Industries to handle the final design work of readying the Romano del Mare to receive customers, and he was obligated to honor that contract. Their design plans that had been months in the making would have to be scrapped altogether, but Leonardo was already legally required to follow through with them. The contract had been agreed upon, and he might as well have signed it in blood, but honoring the contract would mean breaking 33 different preservation laws. They were laws that had not even existed when his great-grandfather had begun the process of converting the old monastery into a resort with the aid of his son, Leonardo's grandfather. The preservation laws that Leonardo and his brothers were being strangled with had come into existence in the years since. And if the Romano del Mare had never shut its doors as an operational resort, it would not have been subject to those laws now. They would have been exempt and able to continue operating and maintaining the property as they'd seen fit. But as soon as the resort had closed its doors, the old monastery's classification had reverted to heritage property and had fallen under the purview of the International Preservation Society, an organization that, before 2 days ago, Leonardo had not even known existed. No steps had been taken to halt the construction that was nearing its completion, and Leonardo noticed when the pounding of hammers and the whir of drills silenced in the halls outside his office. Voices drifted by his door as a dozen or more workmen trundled past on their way to lunch. Leonardo's stomach growled. He'd been sitting in his office all morning, getting nothing done. For the first time in his life, he had no clue as to what action to take next. The uncertainty that filled him was not a feeling he was accustomed to, and he didn't like it. But there was one thing he could do. He could maintain. He could take care of the basics that needed taking care of. His stomach growled again. All he'd had for breakfast was a cappuccino, and that had been over 4 hours ago. Standing up, he headed for his office door with a long, calm stride that did nothing to betray the anxiety that buzzed through his body like an electric current. Most of the renovation crew brought their own lunches, and for those who didn't, a catering truck from a local restaurant came around to offer them hearty, aromatic soups, plus grilled sandwiches. Most days, that's what Leonardo himself ate, but today he needed distance. He had to put the Romano del Mare out of his sight in order to regain some perspective. And there was a new restaurant in town that he'd been hearing good things about. He opened his office door and took in a breath, ready to call out to his assistant to see if she'd like to join him. But the words stalled in his throat. Blinking, he stared at empty space at the end of the hallway where he was sure that he'd seen Stella standing a second before. "Stella?" He waited for an answer, but none came. "Stella!" he said again, this time using the same authoritative tone as would be used by a proctor in an unruly classroom. The Romano del Mare was private property, and she had no business being there without invitation. She most certainly was not on any guest list. Leonardo's tone worked, and Stella's head stuck back around the corner. "Hi," she smiled, brightly, and Leonardo was reminded of the moment when he'd first seen her up near the cliffs. Everything about her made him want to shove her aside and pretend that she didn't exist. She embodied in the flesh all of the new problems that had been dumped on his lap, yet he couldn't seem to take his eyes off of her. "Have lunch with me." His invitation surprised even himself, and it was clear that it surprised Stella as well because she stepped out from her hiding spot around the corner and came into full view. The sight of her hurt Leonardo's heart. She was graceful, ephemeral, and happy. It was as if she glowed with an internal joy that left him mesmerized from looking at her. Wearing a smile that lit her face, Stella said in her distinctly American accent, "I'd love to." Leonardo had to force himself not to laugh. She'd gone from shy and hiding to excited in under a second, and her enthusiasm was contagious. That he found her beautiful was undeniable, but he liked her too. She was completely guileless in a calculated world, and he found that adorable and refreshing. "I have the perfect place in mind." The drive to the restaurant was quiet, but it was a surprisingly comfortable quiet. He kept Stella in his field of vision as he drove his antique Aston Martin DB5 through the countryside to the nearby town. On instinct, he'd put the canopy top of the convertible down, and he watched out of the corner of his eye as Stella drank in her surroundings. There was something unfiltered about her, a willingness to experience everything with a sense of wonder, and he felt drawn to her because of it. "Here we are," he said, pulling up outside a narrow two-story restaurant named Isola di Amici. "Oh," Stella exclaimed, with both hands on the top rim of her door as she stared at the unremarkable gray stone building. But her reaction made Leonardo look again through fresh eyes, and what he saw surprised him. The building was old, possibly 200 years old, yet it housed a modern, thriving restaurant. Walking around to the passenger side door, Leonardo opened it and offered her his hand to assist her in getting out. Startled by her chill touch, he asked, "Are you cold?" But when embarrassment pinked her cheeks in response to his answer, he regretted having asked. It was the first moment since he'd met her that he'd seen her wilt from him and his attentions. Always before, she'd been unabashedly who she was, without any seeming need to fit in. Needing to feel her connection to him, Leonardo smoothly offered his elbow and was pleased beyond measure of the simple act when she slid her hand over his jacketed arm. Together, they crossed the street and entered the restaurant. Inside, the design allowed for a casual intimacy, as the conversations of the patrons were captured by the surrounding plants and stone buttresses. Natural light filled the space with a soft glow that lifted Leonardo's spirits rather than muted his sorrows. Almost immediately, the pair were seated at a table that both allowed for privacy and a sweeping view of the rest of the restaurant. "This place is amazing," Stella marveled. Leonardo looked around, waiting to see what it was that she was seeing, though he was certain that he wasn't. "How do you mean?" Surprise registered on Stella's face as her eyes went round and her brows went up. "It's been renovated. But look." She pointed a finger at a nearby pillar and followed it up to the exposed beam ceiling. "They've left most of the original architecture in place." Leonardo scanned the room, seeing it with fresh eyes. The restaurant emphasized live plants, modern, colorfully vivid paintings, and elegant furniture, tables and chairs. But behind that was a building that could have fit in seamlessly with the architecture of the building's time of origin. Leonardo looked around at the patrons next, their relaxed faces and easy smiles. They were comfortable here, and they were not in a rush to go on with their day. They were willing to stay, their wallets no further away than an arm's reach. They were willing to spend their money here. This restaurant was doing well. The waitress came and went, choosing to memorize their orders rather than write them down. Drinks and hors d'oeuvres were brought next, and then a comfortable time after that, their main dishes. Stella ordered a light fruit salad, plus grilled fish with an artichoke caponata. She leaned over her plate, closed her eyes, and breathed its aroma deep into her lungs. And Leonardo simply watched, once more mesmerized by the peaceful joy that filled her. Opening her eyes, she twirled the long ends of her flowing scarf around each other. That's when Leonardo saw it. Just a flash, just enough that he realized it was there. A scar traced its way down her chest to disappear behind the V of her blouse. A soft, barely there green vine curled its way around the scar and blossomed with pale pink, cherry blossom-like flowers. Something about his expression must have changed, he realized, because Stella's expression changed. Her inner light didn't exactly dim. It's more that it changed from radiant sunlight to the light of a brilliant moon, There was still joy there, but it was a self-aware joy, a conscious joy. What happened? The words tumbled out of his mouth before his measure of what it meant to be a gentleman kicked into place. I'm sorry, he quickly amended. It is none of my business. Her eyes didn't drift from his face as so many people's would have done. Her fingertips delicately traced the long, pale scar. Heart surgery. She said it with a smile, and the smile did reach her eyes, but only just. I needed a new one. A new one. I'm sorry, Leonardo said again, this time for a different reason. He hated that she had been through so much. She had tipped her proverbial hat to death and had told him to come back later. She was the essence of resilient. Stella shook her head, and the brightness of her smile grew, so that finally it crinkled the corners of her eyes and lit her entire face. Every day is a gift to me now, and I am not wasting 1 second of it being sorry about the years that I was sick. I'm well now, and I'm going to enjoy it. She picked up her fork and speared a strawberry before popping it in her mouth. Smiling himself, Leonardo took her lead and dug into his dish of eggplant lasagna. Then he noticed Stella watching him, an amused expression on her face. What? I'm not used to seeing a man eat so light, especially not one as tall and muscular as you. I had thought you might get a hearty steak or something. Don't you know? This is the new hearty, he teased as he took another bite. It keeps me hearty. He inwardly winced at his choice of words, but Stella didn't seem to mind. She dug into her grilled fish with the same happy enthusiasm he'd so quickly grown to expect from her. The waiter came and topped off their glasses of wine, and behind him appeared a slightly portly man with a roundness to his belly that started somewhere up near his chest. He wasn't very tall, but he had powerful arms and thick hands that he rubbed together before giving Leonardo a friendly pat on the shoulder. With a heavy Sicilian accent, he said in perfect English, I am Gus, and this is my place. I want to know if you are having a nice time. He tisked in approval as he looked from one to the other. Such a lovely couple. Can I send you a lover's dessert? Stella coughed and blushed, but Leonardo couldn't stop himself from smiling. The owner's face fell. Oh, scusi, but I am an old fool. I saw the two of you, and I knew for sure that you were lovers. Stella coughed again, and this time Leonardo wasn't able to hold back his laughter. It's all right. In the present company, I take such a mistake as a great compliment. He eyed Stella to catch her reaction to his words. This time, she didn't cough, but she did smile, though her cheeks were as pink as the most vibrant flowers in her tattoo. Sir, Stella said, finding her voice and shifting her attention to the restaurant's owner. Can you tell me, did you follow preservation laws when you remodeled your restaurant? Gus's brows shot halfway to his low hairline. Yes. You did an amazing job. Gus beamed at Stella's compliment. Do you have any regrets? Did it stress your renovation budget? Leonardo asked, determined to make a point to Stella that what was being asked was too much. Regrets? No. It was a lot of hard work, and we had to be inventive in our solutions to problems sometimes, but... He looked all around him, smiling like a proud papa, before returning his attention to them. I am happy. This is home. With it done now, this feels good. Gus's answer rankled Leonardo. He didn't want following the preservation laws to be the way to a better outcome. He wanted to be able to fight it in court for being too burdensome and an impediment to economic stability in the area. With what he was hearing, though, that wouldn't work. Worse yet, he was beginning to suspect that following the preservation laws might provide the best experience for his customers, if they could even get past the Preservation Society's objections to maintaining the Romano del Mare as a fully functional resort with all the necessary amenities that people expected. For instance, the pool would have to stay. Would you show us around? Stella asked, with what seemed to be genuine enthusiasm. Si, it would be my pleasure. Leonardo wanted to hate her in that moment, but as he looked around to Gus's pride and joy, he could only like her more. Chapter 4. Stella. Snapping on her seatbelt, Stella carefully watched Leonardo as he climbed behind the wheel of his car. As beautiful as the restaurant was, she didn't think that it or its gracious owner had succeeded in convincing Leonardo that staying true to a building's original architecture was the best way to go. She had to get him to see that the monastery was worth preserving just as it was without covering up a level of craftsmanship that had been lost with the introduction of mass-produced building supplies. She had to get him to see that new was not necessarily better than old. People had the right to experience the legacies left by their ancestors. Just because he and his brothers owned the Romano del Mare, it didn't give them the right to deprive the rest of the world of an ancient building that was created long before the Romano family ever amassed its fortune. Saving abused or overlooked treasures had been Stella's career since the time she'd graduated college with a double major in history preservation and conservation, plus environmental psychology. She'd wanted to make the world a beautiful place, or at least try to protect those areas that were due to fall victim to corporate greed and a fast-paced society that had forgotten the value of the work done by generations before them. In the hospital or sick at home, all she'd been able to do was to stare at stunning pictures of magnificent castles, English mansions, and majestic Scottish manor homes. So many times families ran out of money and the structures fell into a state of terrible disrepair. Or even worse, they were dismantled and sold as materials. It had been heartbreaking for her as a girl. She was doing everything she could to preserve what was good about her life, while others seemed so willing to throw so much of what was good about the world away. Eventually, preservation became her passion. "Would you mind if we made a stop on the way back?" Stella asked, as she absent-mindedly swirled the ends of her scarf around her hands. Without answering right away, Leonardo looked at her, and she could see some sort of calculation going on behind his eyes. "Sure," he finally answered. "Where to?" "I don't remember the name, but I do remember where it's located. It's just off the town square, down one of the little side streets." Trying to navigate the little Sicilian towns was like getting lost in a magnificent maze, but she thought she could recall the way. Leonardo roared the engine to life before letting it settle into a purr. "You guide, I'll drive," he said, giving her a wink. To her own amazement, Stella was able to guide them through the narrow, winding streets, directing him to turn left here and right over there, until finally they found themselves sitting outside the shop she wanted to show him. It was a used bookstore, and in the few moments since they had arrived, a steady stream of patrons had trundled in and out through the store's front. People walked in empty-handed and walked out laden with a prized new treasure under their arm, or even an entire treasure trove's worth of newfound discoveries. "This is it," Stella said excitedly, opening her car door without waiting for Leonardo to open it for her. "Here?" Leonardo said, his voice full of hesitation. Getting out of the car, he stood with its door open and looked at Stella. "No, no." He shook his head adamantly, and Stella was sure that she heard his usually very soft Sicilian accent get stronger. "This is used books." "What would you want with used books?" "Come, I'll take you to another store. I'll get you whatever you want, on me." "But that's just it," Stella said, pouncing on Leonardo's argument. "Bookstores that focus on selling new books don't have what this bookstore has. Not even close. Inside, they have volume after volume of books that are no longer being produced. They aren't available electronically either. They're only available here in places like here." Stepping away from the car and moving slowly toward the door, she hoped that Leonardo would follow her, rather than sit in his car or, worse yet, drive away, and her heart fluttered with excitement when, with a stony face, he closed his car door and began walking around the car toward her and the bookstore. "You won't regret it," Stella said, barely containing her exuberance. She slipped her arm into his, just as they had done when walking into the restaurant, and it surprised her how natural they moved together, anticipating and understanding each other's intentions. A small bell chimed when Leonardo reached forward and opened the door. He held it as Stella stepped through first, and then he followed close behind. "Mr. Romano!" was the exclamation of a round-faced man with a large nose from behind the checkout counter. He threw his arms into the air in welcome and then waved him over. Stella looked up at Leonardo, and she wasn't unable to contain her gleeful smile. It was clear that Leonardo was a regular patron of the store that he had advocated so hard against entering, and she could best describe the grimace he wore as pained yet good-natured embarrassment. "Dominique," Leonardo said with warm familiarity. Stella stayed right at his side as they approached the counter, eager to not miss a moment of their exchange. "I have those books you were looking for," Dominique said, in a loud, conspiratorial whisper that could have probably been heard throughout the whole bottom floor of the store. "You do?" The sudden, genuine excitement in Leonardo's voice had Stella doing a double take as she stared up at him. He not only frequented this store, he was an enthusiastic patron. Her worldview, as it pertained to Leonardo Romano, shifted just a little. There might be a chance after all, she thought to herself, as she watched him lean over the counter to examine the old, oversized hardcover books that Dominic pulled out from beneath. That Leonardo held the old books in high regard was clear, and glancing at the price tags, they weren't cheap. This was not a money-saving maneuver. Of course, she reminded herself, the billionaire who she stood side by side with didn't need to save any money. He could buy the entire bookstore they were standing in 100 times over and never break a sweat or feel the financial impact. She was standing next to a man who could buy anything he wanted, as long as it was for sale. Yet, here they were, standing in a dusty, used bookstore, and Leonardo had the look of a little boy in a candy shop. "This one covers old homesteading tips for surviving in the American Old West," Dominic said, opening the faded and well-read tome up. "The Old West?" Stella whispered out loud, without having meant to, but it was too late. The spell of boyish excitement that had overtaken Leonardo was gone. "Dominic," Leonardo said, returning back to the subdued style of interacting with people that Stella had begun to anticipate from him. "Please hold these for me here, and I'll pick them up on the way out. I'd like to show your wonderful store off to this young lady." "Of course, anything for you, Mr. Romano." He slipped the large books back underneath the counter, and Stella followed Leonardo's lead as they moved away, deeper into the narrow-spaced bookcases that reached all the way from the floor to the ceiling. "What did you want to pick up here?" Leonardo asked, but his eyes didn't meet hers as he asked it. They instead scanned over the faded spines of the hundreds of books that surrounded them. Stella's brain crashed to a halt as her examination and appreciation of the unexpectedly interesting Leonardo Romano shifted back to herself. In truth, she hadn't been looking for anything other than what she'd already found. Leonardo's appreciation of something old, instead of its modern and flawless counterpart. Leonardo's attention shifted fully to her, and he tucked his chin to his chest in order to glare down at her as he crossed long, strong arms over his solid chest. "You didn't want anything from here, did you?" Stella smiled weakly up at him and shrugged her shoulders as if to say, "Busted." "Then why did you want to come here?" His accent was barely discernible. Stella turned her attention to the books that were eye level with her and stroked her fingertips across them. The selection was eclectic fiction and jumped from old Gothic romances to what could have been first editions of science fiction odysseys considered to be the precursors of the genre itself. "I wanted you to see that sometimes new isn't better." She shifted her gaze to meet his. "But apparently you already knew that." Leonardo's stony expression softened, and then a miracle happened. He smiled. "Come with me," he said, grabbing her hand. He led them through the tight stacks to a spiral staircase that twirled its way up to the second floor. There, the entire space was filled with floor-to-ceiling bookcases, one after another. The old books gave the air a dusty feeling, and the soft overhead light cast as much shadow as it did illumination, yet Stella couldn't think of anywhere else that she would rather be. It was amazing. With her hand still in his, she followed Leonardo as he weaved a path amongst the books. It was clear that he knew exactly where he was going. Turning to walk between two massive bookcases placed just far enough apart that Leonardo's broad shoulders fit between them, Stella found herself standing on the wall side of the passage's dead end. Leonardo didn't seem to notice, though. "Here, look at these." He knelt to see the books on the lower shelves, and Stella followed suit, sitting on the backs of her heels. The spines of the books that Leonardo was pointing at seemed to be of a similar nature to the ones being held for him by Dominic. In some way or other, they were all about the lore of the American Old West. Stella eyed Leonardo's pristine suit, no doubt tailor-made, and costing more than most people's cars. I would have never guessed that someone like you would be fascinated by cowboys, ranchers, and moving big herds of cattle. Her words were not a chastisement, though. That Leonardo was more than he had appeared to be at first glance warmed her heart in a way that had once not been possible. For years, she'd been too sick to do more than appreciate the lives of others and all their intricacies, and even that she'd done as a spectator only. Always, when her energy became too drained, she would pull her emotions back into herself and focus on conserving her strength to make it through another day. At the time, it was the best she could do, but now the heart that had been gifted to her by another was hers to give away as well. And she felt it yearn for Leonardo to look at her the way he did all the surrounding books. A lifestyle lived without the burden of things has been a fascination for me for a long, long time. His voice had gained an easy depth that made her want to wrap the sound around herself. But things are what you do, and you're good at it. You create these pristine, perfect experiences for people and make them crave to take part of that perfect experience home with them. Pictures, souvenirs. I bet there are families who save all year long in order to take their vacation at one of your resorts in order to be surrounded by all the perfect things you've laid out for them. There was a thoughtful melancholy in his eyes when he answered. Sometimes what you do, what you're good at, isn't who you are. Stella couldn't help it. She fell in love with him a little bit right there and then. Not much, just enough to flood her senses with the warm glow that comes with those types of feelings. Sitting up so as to stand on her knees, Stella inched forward to close the space between them, held Leonardo's face in her hands, and stretched her neck with her face tilted up to his. It was an invitation, and an invitation only. If he wanted her, Leonardo would have to do the rest. Which he did. Sliding his warm hand onto the small of her back, Leonardo pulled Stella closer to him before leaning down to take her in a kiss that curled her toes. It was soft and sweet, and the man who always seemed to have the world on his shoulders was unhurried as he dragged his lips over hers. She tasted him, the wine they'd had at lunch, but his scent was the musk of a man, and it was not unlike the books that surrounded them. Earthy, yet slightly sweet, with a teasing hint of almond and vanilla. She melted against him, and his strong arms closed around her so that her chest and stomach lay flat against his, and she no longer tried to hold back the moan that needed to escape her. She gave it to him, letting her sound fill him, and was rewarded by his answering growl. Stella let the kiss linger a moment longer, then rocked back and looked at him from under her eyelashes. She had no idea what this would change between them, whether it might make her job harder. But still, she wouldn't have taken it back for the world. Chapter 5. Leonardo. 2 weeks had passed since his kiss with Stella, and Leonardo was feeling very ready for an encore. He hadn't been able to get out of his mind the soft press of her lips against his, or the wanting sounds she'd made as he'd held her against him, her body crushed to his. He'd wanted that touch again, had needed it, but life always seemed to conspire to keep them apart. Emergencies, bickering between the hired design firm, the budget manager and his lawyers regarding the preservation laws, and simple bad luck had consumed his attention without mercy or respite. So when she'd come into his office that morning in a rare moment of quiet and asked him to drive her somewhere, he'd told his assistant, Bianca, to cancel his afternoon meetings and had left with her right there and then. Come what may, the restoration of the Romano del Mare would finish, and it would be done with plans to open the entire property for use as a resort, not just parts of it. Despite Stella's appearance turning the design plans upside down, the fact that they were in the final stages of the resort's restoration hadn't changed. And whether they would have to pay the steep penalties that would go with ignoring preservation laws or adapt their plans to fall in line with Stella's vision for the place, the truth remained unchanged. The restoration of the Romano del Mare would finish, and Stella would go away. While the finish line was once a goal that Leonardo had been racing for, he now didn't want to see it come. He wanted the time to get to know Stella. He wanted the time to spend with her. He thought about her any time she wasn't near, and when she was near, her inner light eclipsed all the rest of the world. He was smitten. He knew it, but he couldn't do a damn thing about it. He'd never been one to involve himself in a summer fling, always before preferring to go the route of a long-term affair. But for her, he was willing to make an exception. He glanced over at her and smiled even though she wasn't looking at him. She had yet another scarf with her, this one as unique as all the others with its pattern of splashed watercolors. With it tied around her head as a makeshift bonnet, she had her face lifted to the sun and the wind as they drove in his convertible along the zigzagging country roads to a spot 2 towns away. Beyond telling him where they were going, she'd refused to tell him what they were going to do. So, for all he knew, she'd found another used bookstore to explore. Her eyes opened the tiniest bit, and he could see her look at him out of the corner of her eye. "Aren't you supposed to be watching the road?" she asked, in a teasing sing-song voice that managed to lift itself above the wind. "Not when I have someone as pretty as you with me." He was smiling, but he was serious. "If you can't watch the road every time you get a pretty girl in the car with you, it's a wonder you're still alive," she said, laughing. "Or maybe I don't make a habit of driving around with pretty girls." She turned to give him the full of her attention, her eyes narrowing as she assessed him. 33, more handsome than, well, you know how handsome you are, and rich enough to take every person in Sicily out to dinner for the finest dining the island has to offer and not be bothered by the bill, but doesn't drive around with a pretty girl in his car every day of the week?" Leonardo shook his head while giving her as much attention as he could spare from the road. "Last time I had a pretty girl in this car was 2 weeks ago." Stella fell silent, but a pleased-looking smile pulled at the corners of her sweet mouth. It was another 30 minutes before they reached their destination, and they'd held hands during those stretches of uninterrupted driving when Leonardo hadn't needed his hand for shifting gears. Oh, that was it!" Stella exclaimed as she twisted around in her seat to look behind them. Leonardo found a spot to make a tight U-turn and returned them to the store that had Stella fidgeting with excitement to reach. "Antiques?" But he was glad for the distraction and happy to escape the tensions of the design staff. He had no idea what Stella thought she would achieve by bringing him here. People did not spend hundreds and thousands of dollars to go on vacation just so that they could stare at other people's discarded and unwanted items. "I know you mean well." "Just give it a chance," Stella said, interrupting him. "I know that you've spent well over €1,000,000 on your restoration costs, but it doesn't have to be like that with your decoration costs. Places like this, there are so many amazing things to find." "Amazing enough things to find that can provide a uniformly good experience to every customer who walks through our doors?" he said, as he unbuckled himself, got out, and headed around to her side of the car. Opening the door, he offered her his hand to assist her in getting out. As always, he was startled by the cold of her fingers, and this time when she got out of the car, instead of offering her his elbow, he kept hold of her hand, wanting to give her his warmth. "It doesn't have to be a uniform experience," she argued, and he could hear the passion in her voice. She believed the words she was saying. "Building a brand is about providing a consistent experience," Leonardo countered as they walked to the store's door. He opened it and held it open as Stella passed through, releasing her hand as she did so. But as soon as he stepped through the threshold to return to his spot by her side, he captured her hand in his once more. She was different from anyone he'd ever spent time with or had romantic feelings for. She seemed fragile and delicate to him. Yet, just like watching a butterfly, he delighted in seeing her spread her wings and dance on the air without any regard for the challenges life may throw her way. She was spectacular, and if he had his way, she would have already been sharing his bed. But that fact did nothing to change how he felt about her ideas for the Romano del Mare. He was a businessman, and the result of the restoration needed to support a business model and a branded advertising campaign that had people traveling the world over to stay at their resort. But consistent doesn't necessarily mean same, she insisted. She tightened her grip on his hand and marched forward ahead of him, pulling him through the sordid collections of knickknacks and antiques. In truth, the items the store had for sale were of good quality. Leonardo knew about more than just the modern styles that he advocated at the myriad of Romano resorts found round the world. He had a practiced eye, which allowed him to pick out an antique reproduction from the genuine article, and whoever was the curator for the store appeared to have the same ability. He hadn't spotted a fake antique yet. Stella slowed down, and when she released his hand so that she could pick up a white platter with a delicate light blue pattern depicting a countryside surrounded by intricately detailed filigree, he missed the feel of her touch immediately. Ceramic Staffordshire, Leonardo offered, recognizing the piece. It's beautiful. Stella's voice was full of awe, and she handled the platter with the same reverence as if she were holding a priceless Stradivarius violin. I agree, but would the Preservation Society approve of a dish from the 1830s meshed with a structure that predates it by over 500 years? No, but it's nice to look at all the same, she said wistfully, putting the platter back on the wire cradle that allowed it to sit upright. I'll buy it for you. Leonardo swiveled his head in search of a salesperson. No, Stella said emphatically, but with good humor. I thought you liked it. Leonardo studied her face, determined to learn her every expression. I love it, but I don't want it. It's enough to know that such pieces exist. I'd rather it be somewhere it can be appreciated. I don't want it stuck away in my cupboard or on some out-of-the-way spot on my wall. I don't need it. Who would ever see it? Who would ever see it? Leonardo suddenly wanted to know. They were both adults. They both had their pasts, but to his surprise, Stella blushed, and her gaze fell this way and that, and he knew that she didn't have anyone special in her life. No casual lover to fill a need now and again. His next thought wasn't one that had occurred to him before, but now, looking at her, he was sure. She was alone. More alone than she wanted to be or would admit to being. He had not considered that to be true about himself prior to meeting her, but he was starting to reevaluate. Looking at her was like looking at what his life could be. It was like staring into a mirror that revealed all the possibilities, only to remind you of the emptiness caught in the reflection of what stood behind you. Come on, he said, reclaiming her hand with what was quickly becoming a lover's touch. This time it was he who guided them, as they moved from table to table, from one roughly sorted collection to the next. It wasn't long before something caught Stella's eye, though, and she once more tightened her grip on his hand and pulled him along with her. He knew that she could have just as easily released him to run ahead, but it warmed his heart that she had wanted to share the journey with him by keeping him near instead. Look! They were standing in a back corner of the shop that was out of sight from most of the rest of the store. Leonardo's brows lifted when he saw what it was that she had found. Knockers. He picked up one of the heavy carved pieces of brass to study it. Unlike the platter, the knocker was from a time period similar to the monastery. It was meant to be affixed to a heavy wooden door, and the knocker's sturdy ring was meant to pound out the announcement of a person's arrival by banging against the ornate metal plate beneath. His brows went up again when he took in the price. Reasonable didn't begin to describe it. Either the shop owner didn't know what they had, or not very many people were in the market for such a collectible. He suspected the latter. There's more down here. Stella squatted and tried to pull a cardboard box from beneath the open-faced counter. The box moved an inch and then tore at the spot where Stella pulled on it because its contents were so heavy. Leonardo squatted down next to her to take a closer look at what she had found. It was more knockers, each one different from the last, but each one within 100 years in age to the monastery. What if these were installed on the outer door of each suite of the rooms at the resort? Leonardo studied the box. There weren't enough knockers to give every suite store one of them, but that didn't mean they couldn't find more. The design team would not be happy about this. It doesn't fit in with their plans. He looked at Stella. She seemed to be holding her breath. But He felt himself caving into her desires as words came out of his mouth. That doesn't mean that they can't adjust their plans. I mean, I am the boss. Stella squealed and threw her arms around his neck, but when she leaned in to kiss him, Leonardo pulled back. With their first kiss, she had kissed him. Sure, he'd had to complete the link by leaning into the kiss, but it had been her doing. This time, he wanted it to be his doing. He wanted her to know that he wasn't simply going along with the flow. He wanted her, needed her. Cradling the back of her head, he captured the gaze of her wide eyes with his own. He didn't say anything, yet as he stared into her eyes, he was aware of how her cheeks turned pink and her lips parted to let her breath come a little faster, a little deeper. She blinked once. She blinked twice. And then her lids softened, closing halfway. She was surrendering to his want. He could see it in her and feel it in the easing of the tension she held in her body. Finally, he leaned into her, guiding her lips in a dance that soon had his heart hammering as his own breath quickened. He pulled her against him and slid his hand up the nape of her neck to cradle her head, and when she moaned into his mouth without seeming to hold anything back, it was nearly his undoing. His body jerked with the overwhelming desire to lay her down on the floor and take her right then and there. Ahem. It was the pointed clearing of a woman's throat, and the sound came from a place only a few feet away from where Leonardo encapsulated Stella in his arms. He glanced worriedly at Stella. She was so new to him. He didn't know the boundaries of her sensibilities yet, and he didn't want their interruption to be the end of their kiss. He could live with it being a pause with a continuation to come, but if he had to wait another 2 weeks before having her in his arms again, he'd have half his staff fired out of sheer frustration. Stella gasped and looked over her shoulder at the stern shopkeeper, but then buried her face in Leonardo's shoulder in a fit of giggles that soon erupted into full-blown laughter. Going off balance, she pulled them to the floor in a tangle of limbs, and Leonardo was helpless to do anything but watch the very annoyed shopkeeper stomp away. Glancing down at Stella beneath him, though, he knew that any slight was worth it. And when he leaned down over Stella, giving her his weight and taking her in another kiss, all of her giggles were gone. Chapter 6. Stella. A long weekend had passed with Stella furiously adapting her renovation plans for the Romano del Mare to a less stringent version, and she couldn't wait to show them to Leonardo. Her new design allowed for more of the features that he tended to include throughout his various hotels. He'd liked to pamper his customers, but her original design had allowed for only very basic adaptations. She'd changed that, though, and with those changes, she hoped that he would be more willing to implement her vision, which was still in compliance with the preservation laws. "Where are you?" Stella muttered to herself as she stuck her head into Leonardo's office. His assistant wasn't at her desk, and Leonardo was nowhere to be found. Turning down the hall, Stella walked in whatever direction that her nose happened to be pointing. Sometimes she took a new hallway, sometimes she went straight, but the resort's hallways were eerily quiet and empty today. Scrunching her nose, Stella scratched at her head where her new hair extensions pulled at her scalp, while she turned in a circle trying to figure out what direction to go next. That's when she saw it. The box of antique door knockers that they'd found together. She hurried down the hallway toward it and knelt beside it to pick through the collection. There were even more knockers there than what they'd seen that day. Stella's heart soared. Not only had Leonardo bought the knockers, but he'd also furthered their effort by finding what looked like enough knockers to install one on every door of each suite's main entrance. Not giving it any thought, Stella scratched her head and pulled at her hair some more. "I can help you with that." It was a woman's voice that seemed to come out of nowhere. Stella pivoted around in her squatted position until she found the voice's owner. It was a tall woman with a pixie haircut that had been gelled up and was spiky all over her head. Sorry?" Stella had no clue what the woman was offering. "Your hair," the woman said, giving her own hair a little tug, as if to mime what she was talking about. "I can help you with those, hair extensions," the woman said, hair extensions, in such a way that Stella got the impression that the woman felt as she was being generous in her description. They are pretty awful, aren't they? Stella said, as she stood up before pulling and scratching at her head some more. I'm Angela, the resort's new salon manager and stylist. Come, she said, extending her arm and waving Stella in with a flip of her wrist. Stella did as she was bid, and the woman enveloped her shoulders with her arm as they walked into one of the largest rooms she'd seen in the resort. It was still in a state of slight disarray, with the salon's modeling still in the works, but it was clear that the floor plan was coming together well. Luciana, Jean-Pierre's girlfriend, is coming in for a blowout, so I'll take care of you too. I'm Stella. Angela laughed. We all know who you are. Sit. Stella sat down in the large pedestal-style salon chair that Angela had guided her to. You know who I am? See, you are the woman who wants to take all of our jobs away. Stella's mouth fell open, and her cheeks heated. She took a quick breath to lob a defense, but Angela cut her off. Hush now, she said with a laugh. We all know Leonardo. There is no way that you will be able to stop him from making the Romano del Mare the sparkling gem for this entire region once more. That boy is like his grandfather. At least, that's what my matri says. She said that there was no stopping that man, and she says that Leonardo is just like him. So, we hold nothing against you. You are doing your job just like the rest of us. We like that. We? Angela moved to stand behind Stella and lifted sections of her hair, tisking as she did so. Who did this to you? It's no matter. I'll fix. We? Stella prompted again, as Angela did something to her hair. There was instant relief, as one of the weaved-in hair extensions fell to the ground. We? The people who work here. We all work. We provide for our families. We do what our bosses tell us. You're doing what your boss tells you. So we hate your boss, not you. Stella leaned back against the chair and breathed a heavy sigh. She had no idea that the people who worked at the resort had any feelings about her at all. After all, the place wasn't even open for business yet. But maybe that didn't matter. Being open for business meant tourists walking through the door, but the people who would have to take care of those tourists would need to be already in place with training as to what to do in any given situation. It's okay, Angela soothed, as she freed Stella's scalp from yet another section of the hair extensions. Everything's good. Things move forward. My new flooring will be here next week. Stella started to sit forward in the chair, but Angela's hold on her hair kept her in place. New flooring? See, Angela said excitedly. Cork. Cork? See, Leonardo let me pick between 7 different design styles. He's so nice. He didn't have to let me pick anything. Cork? Stella's head was reeling. There was no way that cork flooring would pass the Preservation Society's inspection. It was unlikely that the Preservation Society would block the Romano del Mare from opening its doors as a resort, but they would most likely be able to delay the opening. They would try to bury the resort in red tape and fines. They were very aggressive with those who did not comply with the preservation laws. Stella knew that she had to talk to Leonardo as soon as possible. Those floors could not be allowed to be installed. Angela? A tap of knuckles against the open door followed the unfamiliar sound of a woman's voice. Glancing toward it, Stella sucked in a surprising breath at how beautiful the woman before her was. She had to be a model arriving for an ad campaign shoot. There was no other explanation for it. Luciana, please sit. Stella's hair was a crime scene. I had to do something about it. Whoever did this to you should lose their license. Stella? Luciana had a smile that lit her entire face, and her eager happiness at meeting Stella as she sat in a stylish chair next to her was undeniable. I'm so happy to meet you. Me? Stella couldn't believe her ears. Do we know each other? Oh, don't mind me, Luciana said, reaching forward to give Stella's arm a friendly pat. I'm Jean-Pierre's girlfriend, and we and Leonardo spent the weekend at Adeline and Nicolo's new place. That boy wouldn't shut up about you. He wouldn't shut up about me? Stella was beginning to feel like a parrot, and her mind was spinning with all of the new information coming her way. Oh, she laughed, as relief flooded her senses. It's because I've been such a pest, right? She knew that they had shared a couple of kisses, but the man was a billionaire. And even if he didn't have a euro to his name, he was gorgeous enough to date any Victoria's Secret model he wanted. There was no way she'd turn his head beyond some fun flirting. "No, I don't think that was it," she said, her expression turning somber. "He seemed really smitten. Every half hour at least, he'd work you into the conversation in some way all weekend long. He really likes you." The insides of Stella's belly did a somersault. Leonardo liked her. Her thoughts turned to the box of door knockers out in the hallway as a cold chill moved through her. What if he'd gotten them for the simple reason of making her happy? What if he had no intentions of using them? Oh, this won't do. She couldn't have him going along with her ideas today, only to turn his back on them tomorrow if he grew tired of her. She needed him to believe in a restoration that protected and respected the original craftsmanship that was so finely captured within the ancient monastery. The future of the Romano del Mare, and the chance for thousands of people to see the monastery in its original glory, depended on it. There was simply too much at stake for her to allow emotions to get in the way. There was business, and there was pleasure, and it was time to separate the two. Chapter 7. Leonardo. "Not today." Leonardo spotted Stella walking across the parking lot toward the Romano del Mare's front entrance. She was dressed in jeans that hugged low on her hips and a colorful t-shirt that outlined her body with even the barest of encouragement from the wind. To top the ensemble off, she wore her hair in pigtail braids down both sides of her face, with their ends resting on her collarbones. He adored seeing her, but it was too much. He'd just escaped a meeting to get some fresh air and solitude. Inside, his lawyers were continuing to wage their fight against the preservation laws, and an all-out yelling match was underway as differing opinions of what he should do warred with each other. He did not need Stella's gentle nudge on top of that. Not today. Turning away and stepping toward the large double-ornate doors of the monastery's front entrance, he pretended not to see her. "Leonardo!" The colorful voice was something he could not ignore. It reached inside of him and held him tight, just as strong as if she'd put her hands on him. He looked over his shoulder and then turned to face her. "Stella!" he called back to her in greeting. He started to force a smile, but then was surprised when there was no need to force it. It came all on its own. "You're here on a Saturday?" she asked as she reached him. Leaning up on tiptoes, she gave him a kiss on the cheek in greeting. "At least you're not wearing a suit today," she teased, giving him a wink. You're the reason I'm here." Stella tilted her head and looked at him quizzically. Pointing a thumb over his shoulder, he said, "The lawyers are inside, arguing, trying to figure a way past the preservation laws." Stella's brow went up and her smile brightened. "Then they're doing what they love to do. But it's Saturday, and I want to do what I love to do too." She took his hand in hers and held on to it in a flirtatious way that had the tension easing from Leonardo's shoulders with each passing second. The headache that had been trying to latch on gave up as well. "You don't want to run headlong into the middle of them and fight your battle?" "No, not today. I like you, Leonardo. A lot." Leonardo's heart stumbled over itself. He hadn't had a girl come straight out and tell him she liked him since he'd been a young boy. Her unabashed candor was unnerving, and he felt all of his defenses crumbling away because of it. "Whatever it is that is developing between us, I don't want the fighting and maneuvering that's going on inside of that building to be a part of it," Stella continued with a somber sincerity in her eyes. "I'd rather give us room to find out who we are together without all the added baggage. I want that to be separate from—" She paused, then smiled shyly. "Whatever this is." Leonardo was speechless, and he felt the weight of the world, or at least part of it, lift from his shoulders. Capturing her other hand, he bent low and kissed the backs of both her hands. Then, when he stood, he stepped close enough to feel her heat. He slipped his hand behind her head as he bent to kiss her. Then he smiled as he felt her breath hitch and saw her eyes flutter. It seemed that it was her turn to be speechless, but she regained her composure quickly. "There's a path," she said with a voice that was unnecessarily breathy. Reaching behind her, she pulled a hiking map out of her back pocket and then stepped back, so that she could unfold it between them. "I've been hiking the trails in the area since I got here, and I'd like to follow this one." She pointed to the map and traced her finger over a thin, lined route. "It looks like the path starts on the Romano del Mare's property, and I've been keeping an eye out for it, but I haven't been able to find it. Do you know where it is by any chance?" "Si," Leonardo said. He hadn't let his eyes travel from her face for even 1 second. She was far more interesting and beautiful than any map. It was too bad that any fling that they would have would be temporary. They were both globe hoppers, going to the different corners of the earth for their differing businesses. It was only that the stars had aligned just right that they were both here now. But knowing that it was temporary made it easier not to hold anything back. He could love her. Then they could part, and she would remain forever perfect in his memories. It was sweeter this way, and would never be marred by life's damaging stresses that pull and twist people into shapes no longer recognizable as them. "Good. Could you point me in the right direction? I don't want to interrupt what you've got going on." "No." "No?" "No. It is far too complicated. Come with me." Laying her by the hand, he guided her around the end of the building and began to trek up toward the pool. Once there, he pointed down a gentle slope where a well-worn path clearly began. She laughed and then challenged him. "You said it was complicated." "Yes. My feelings about going back inside of that building with those lawyers is very complicated." He said it deadpan, but then smiled as her own smile crinkled her eyes at his little joke. "Come on." "You're going with me?" she asked, her voice full of surprise. "Si," he said, as he led them down to where the path began. It was a path that he'd traveled often as a boy, every time he'd visited with his grandparents, and he looked forward to seeing it through her fresh eyes. The walk was nice, and they stopped at various spots so that Leonardo could point out the history of the land they traveled on. The path was winding, and sometimes hugged the cliffs overlooking the sea, and, at other times, dipped to circle around the base of hills. Stella marveled at the small oasis of sorts that had grown up around a natural spring at the bottom of a valley. She waded in it barefoot before becoming captivated by a beautiful yellow flowering cactus further up the trail. It was almost an hour before they reached the trail's end at the opening of a secluded private beach. At the path's edge was a faded, hand-painted sign. Stella sounded out the words as a light blush crept its way into her cheeks. "Does that say what I think it says?" "Hmm?" Leonardo said, pretending not to have noticed the sign until that moment. "Ah, yes. It's a topless-only beach." Stella leaned and craned her neck as she looked down the path at the open expanse of cliff-sided beach. "But there's nobody there." Leonardo shrugged. "Rules are rules." A mischievous light turned on in Stella's eyes. "Rules? Is that the way it is?" Leonardo shrugged again, doing his best to act nonchalant, but there was nothing he could do to stop his growing smile. "That's a pretty old sign. I wonder if whoever made it is even still around." The look she gave him said that she was pretty sure the sign's creator was standing right in front of her. "Maybe it was made by some overeager hormonal teenager." Leonardo gave her his best wounded look. To be found guilty, when he was, did nothing to reward the ingenuity his teenage self had shown. Turning his attention to the sign, he said, "But to withstand the weather after so many years, it is a good sign, no?" That was as far as he got, though, in his argument of defense of his younger self. For when he'd returned his gaze to Stella, it was to find her stripping her top off. Underneath, she wore a bra that was so sheer that it emphasized her lovely bits so much more than hid them. The sight of her instantly sent heat to that part of himself that had ached to be introduced to her since the first day he'd seen her. "Rules are rules," she said, as she backed away from him in the direction of the beach. She had her shirt wadded up into her hands and tossed it into a nearby bush. Following her at a pace that matched her own, Leonardo stripped his shirt off and threw it to the side. "You do not fight fair." He didn't know what battle it was that she was fighting in this moment, but it made no matter. Whatever it was, she was winning. Chapter 8. Stella. Stealing a glance over her shoulder, Stella laughed as she ran. She was far ahead of a sauntering Leonardo, and her pauses to strip herself free of her bra, shoes, jeans, and even her panties did nothing to the lead she had on him. By the time she reached the water's edge and splashed into its gentle lapping surf to dive in and come up for air 15 feet away from the shore, she still had plenty of time to watch the show. Turning around to face the shore, she locked her hungry eyes on the incredibly virile, bigger-than-life man whose attention she had inexplicably captured. Why he was interested in her was a mystery, but it wasn't one she was interested in trying to figure out. At least, not while he was pulling his shirt over his head to leave bare his sculpted muscular chest. He had the body of a swimmer, unbelievably broad and powerful shoulders, long arms, toned flat abs. Leonardo wadded up his shirt and threw it to the side with a decisive toss, and Stella licked the salt from her lips with eager anticipation as his hands went to his jeans. Standing a foot from the water's edge, he towed off his shoes as he unbuttoned and then unzipped the denim at his waist. Laying the flaps open to expose more flat stomach, he then bent double to push his jeans down his strong thighs. When he stood up, Stella did her best to hide her voyeuristically gleeful smile. What Leonardo had, Stella liked. The cool waters swirled around her naked body as Stella waved her arms back and forth beneath the rippling surface. She anchored herself in place by sinking her toes into the sandy sea bottom. She was fine. She was good. But her heart thumped hard, and her breath came fast, as if she had been running a marathon as she watched Leonardo wade into the water. It splashed up his shins before reaching his thighs, and Leonardo was unabashed in his nakedness. He took his time. He was in no hurry to hide himself within the same waters that Stella now wore like a cloak. By the time that Leonardo reached the spot where Stella stood, with water up over her shoulders, that same water only came up to his sternum. But as she watched, he sank down into it until the water reached the dimple at the bottom of his neck. "Cara mio, are you cold? You're shivering." Trembling with excitement was more like it. It was taking every ounce of Stella's willpower not to swim into Leonardo's arms and wrap herself around him. He was like a celestial body whose gravitational pull she ached to stop resisting. She wanted to fall into him, but the words that came out of her mouth were, "I'm fine." "No, you're not," Leonardo insisted. He drifted toward her until their bodies almost met, yet he didn't touch her. "You're not fine. You're exquisite." His eyes stared at her parted mouth, and he leaned in so close that she could feel the heat of his words on her lips when he spoke. "You came to ruin my work, but you've only ruined my mind. All I think about is you, all day, and deep into the night. You fill my thoughts, cara." Stella gasped at Leonardo's fearless confession, but her one gasp was all that she had time for before his lips closed on hers. Without her permission, her arms wrapped themselves around Leonardo's neck, and her legs encircled his waist as his powerful arms pulled her in to hold her body against his. Heat surged through her at their full-bodied skin-on-skin connection. Even the cold of the ocean's waters did nothing to appease the scorching heat of his hands on her. She'd spent years of her life simply existing, getting by from one moment to the next and holding on with another breath and yet another weak heartbeat that left her lips pale, or even sometimes blue. Getting a new heart had been a rebirth. It was not just an improved life, it was a new life that held no resemblance to the life she'd had before, and this moment, now, with Leonardo, was all that mattered. Yesterday was done. Tomorrow didn't yet exist. There was only now, here, with Leonardo as he took her in a kiss that had her mind swimming and made her body feel as though she might swoon and drown right there in his arms. When his mouth pulled away from hers, she held him close with her cheek pressed to his as she panted and then whimpered his name. "Leonardo." That was when the world moved. Leonardo's arms tightened around her, and he stood. The water fell away from them, dropping to Leonardo's sternum and Stella's waist. He pivoted, and Stella felt the sun's warming rays on her naked back. The warmth of it radiated through her skin and into her bones. It was exactly what she'd needed, and Leonardo had known it even when she hadn't. Sighing, she sank further into him. If there were an earthquake that destroyed the world, he and she would still be safe. Leonardo was like a titan, and for the first time in her uncertain life, she felt invulnerable. She felt his body shift as one of his hands slid around to her side. She pulled back in order to be able to look him in the eyes, and what she saw was a layered depth of passionate sincerity that left her heart unguarded to his effects. He slid his large palm over her stomach and up her middle until it covered her scar. Its warmth bore its way into her chest and fueled her with an excited energy that made her want to devour Leonardo, or be devoured by him. "Tell me what this is." There was a gentle patience in Leonardo's gaze as he made his quiet demand. Stella glanced down at his hand before looking back up at him. She put her hand over his. "They gave me someone else's heart. They cut mine out because it wasn't strong enough, and I was dying slowly. I was mostly fine as a child, but as a teenager my heart stopped being able to keep up with my body's needs. Then, when I was running out of time, with maybe a week or two left, they gave me a new heart." "When?" Leonardo's expression held an anguish that Stella hadn't been expecting to see. "And tell me whose heart it is that they gave you, so I can honor their gift." His normally barely there accent grew rich and thick as emotion poured itself into his voice. Stella shook her head and squeezed his hand. "They wouldn't tell me, but I sent a letter to the family with the help of the hospital. I let them know," her voice faltered, "that I was living every minute, that I wasn't taking anything for granted." Leonardo dipped his head to kiss her tattooed scar. "And this?" he asked, brushing his thumb over one of the vining blooms that twined itself round her scar. "A celebration," Stella said, smiling, "of my life beginning, of being in full bloom." "Cara mio," Leonardo whispered, pulling Stella in and capturing her lips again. She sank her hands into his thick hair and held on as they lost themselves in each other. Stella's heart soared that Leonardo was not gentle with her. His lips were crushing and his embrace was unyielding. He wasn't handling her like a porcelain doll, afraid that she might break from all that he had to offer her. And Stella didn't want part of him. She wanted all of him. She wanted all that he was and all that they could be together, not a watered-down version of their potential.
Sorry, readers. Here's where we fade to black due to YouTube explicit content guidelines. If you dream for the steam, you'll need to take a look in the book.
She felt the hard muscles of his body relax and knew that he was back in the world with her. Together they sank into the Ionian Sea's embrace, but their bodies stayed merged, even though their dance was done. For the longest time, saying nothing, Stella snuggled against Leonardo's chest with her cheek pressed into his neck. He kissed her hair and held her with arms that could protect her from anything, she was sure. Finally, Leonardo shifted and their bodies, joining, broke, but Leonardo continued to hold her tight as he walked with sure steps toward the shore. The water fell away from them, leaving the sun to warm Stella's skin, and soon she found herself laid down on the sandy beach next to Leonardo. Leonardo laid on his back, and Stella used his shoulder as a pillow. "This beach is beautiful." You're beautiful," Leonardo mumbled, as if half awake. Stella laughed as she sat up. "No, really, this is paradise." There was awe in her voice. "How did this place stay so nice?" She looked around her. The stretch of beach sandwiched between two rocky cliffs was over 100 meters wide. The white sand was soft and gentle to the touch, and it looked as though they were the first ones to visit it in many years. Leonardo opened one eye and glanced around them before closing it again. "My family owns this stretch of beach. We have for generations, and we've protected it and preserved it." Preserved it? Something in the way Stella had said the words had Leonardo opening up both of his eyes. She let a heartbeat or two pass between them before continuing. "Has it been worth it?" Leonardo's eyes stayed locked with hers. He didn't answer right away, and Stella could see the gears of his mind turning. Finally, he said, "Undoubtedly." Stella smiled. It was small at first, but it grew quickly. Can you think of anywhere else that would be worth preserving? Leonardo's lips thinned and his eyes narrowed. Then, in a flash of movement, he had her in his arms and pinned under him. There, he nuzzled her nose with his, before taking her lips in a kiss. Undoubtedly, he whispered. Chapter 9. Leonardo. I don't care what I said before, Leonardo swore into his phone from within his office at the Romano del Mare. It was late afternoon, and Leonardo had agonized for the last 3 days before coming to a conclusion. Stella had been right. She'd always been right. The Romano del Mare deserved to shine as the masterpiece of craftsmanship that it was. It was a Sicilian treasure, and it deserved to be preserved as such. Seeing the beach that his family had protected for generations through her eyes finally made him take in the old monastery for what it was instead of what he thought it should be. I've decided to go with the Preservation Society's design plans. He would, of course, add a few modifications, but they would be minor. The cost of going with the Preservation Society's plans would ultimately mean the loss of a couple of million euro, as various restoration projects through the building and property were carefully dismantled and redone in a manner that maintained the integrity of the original building, rather than cover it up. Only the massive center courtyard would be spared any changes. And Leonardo would insist that the very modern pool near the cliffs be allowed to remain intact. As a resort, they needed to be able to provide an experience that people wanted to have again, or at the very least, recommend to other travelers. They would still offer their customers a luxury experience, but it would not be centered around the modern, ultra-clean, minimalistic, and chic design that had been planned. Each suite of rooms would not be given its own theme with unique flooring, furniture, and lighting features. Instead, each suite would retain its original look, or very close to it. Lavish beds with mattresses pricing in at 10,000 euro apiece, with the finest linens money could buy, would compensate for the cold, harsh stonework that housed the bed. A personal butler for every suite would be an amenity that few places could offer. And as for the food, it would be the best in the region. It could be done. The integrity of the Romano del Mare's original design could be saved while still providing a coveted experience to those who would travel halfway around the globe to stay there. You can't do this, said Marcello, Leonardo's head of branding. I can't? Marcello must have heard the warning note in Leonardo's tone, and he quickly amended what he was saying. I mean, Leonardo, you shouldn't do this. I've seen the Preservation Society's design, and it's nice. But it's not us. It's not Romano Hotels. People see one of your hotels and they know what to expect, just like a Hilton or a Marriott. Customers go to the Romano Hotel more than once because they want consistency. The Romano del Mar needs to fit the brand of the rest of your hotel chain. If it doesn't, you could end up with a lot of unhappy customers that smear your brand name on the internet. If your competitors then jump on the bandwagon, there's no telling how much business you could lose worldwide. Leonardo sat back in his chair, feeling as though he'd just had the wind knocked out of him. From what Marcello was saying, not only would Leonardo be poised to lose millions from doing yet another redesign of the Romano del Mare, but he would be at risk of losing tens of millions worldwide. He couldn't do that. Not even the Romano del Mare was worth that kind of risk. Silence filled Leonardo's office until he heard Marcello clear his throat. There was more that the man wanted to say, but he was nervous to do so. Leonardo had worked with him for almost 10 years. He knew his ways. See, Leonardo said, giving Marcello clearance to say what he had to say, no matter how uncomfortable it was for Leonardo to hear it. I've heard a rumor. Marcello's voice was strained, and when he didn't go on, warning bells went off in Leonardo's head. Leaning forward in his chair, Leonardo asked, What is it? Gallant Industries. They've started getting nervous that you're going to break the contract with them, and they've put together a smear campaign. They've got a backer. I don't know who, but it's a corporation with deep pockets. They want to hurt you, Capo. Leonardo hissed out of breath. Si, grazie, Leonardo said, thanking him. They ended the call a few minutes later, and Leonardo once more sat heavily back in his chair as he considered his situation. It wasn't good. It wasn't good at all. He was trapped into a situation of being damned if he went one way and damned if he went the other way. Closing his eyes and steepling his fingers, he worked through the problem backwards and forwards. He mentally explored the various avenues, considering what it would take to overcome the obstacles in each direction. And he considered the cost. He could find no way around it. He would have to honor his contract with Gallant Industries, although he would never work with them again. Their underhanded handling of the prospect of losing his business would cost them dearly. He would see to it. Just as they had planned to smear his family's name within the hotel industry and the world at large, he would make sure to burn every bridge they had with regards to procuring new clients within the hotel industries. If he had broken the contract with them, he would have gladly paid them compensation for the loss of time and man-hours in addition to a penalty fee. But now he would move forward with his business with them, and then would sever all his ties to them with regard to any Romano business from here to perpetuity. As for Stella, he would have to test her words about wanting to separate the affection that was growing between them from the business of whose design vision for the Romano del Mare would be honored. He had a ball of pressure in his chest that refused to go away when he thought about going against Stella's wishes. Her mind and spirit were everything that he hoped for in life, and he had wanted to pour her love for what the Romano del Mare could be into a resort that would be destined to gain world recognition as the place to go for a premier holiday experience. His thoughts then turned to the Preservation Society and the battles that his lawyers had been waging against their rules. There was no turning back from it. He would need to call on every lawyer on retainer within the Romano Empire and hire any specialist necessary to overcome their objections so that he could move forward with their original renovation and design plans. There was no other way. As costly as that path would be, it was the best decision. He would not allow the Romano del Mare, a single resort in an army of Romano hotels, to jeopardize all that his family and he personally had toiled to create. Leonardo lightly rapped his knuckles against the door of the garden-level apartment that the Preservation Society had rented for Stella. When she opened the door, her eyes went wide with surprise, and her lips graced him with the prettiest smile the world had ever known. She was wearing loose-fitting yoga pants that looked as though they belonged on a genie. They had a wide band that hugged her middle, but the fabric of the legs flared and draped with an easy-flowing nature that was mesmerizing to Leonardo's eyes. But he was not so distracted that he didn't notice the tiny little spaghetti string top that she wore that clung to every wonderful inch of her. "Do you have something for me?" Stella asked. "Huh?" Leonardo said, as his attention refocused. "Your hand is behind your back." Leonardo gave her what he knew must be a sheepish grin as he presented her with a bundle of yellow-throated white plumera flowers that smelled of jasmine and honeysuckle. He had forgotten he had them. He'd been so wrapped up in the sight of her. Leaning in, he gave her a kiss, and she took him by the hand and led him to a sofa inside. There she plopped down with one slender leg tucked under her and pulled him down to sit beside her. "You said you were going to have to work late. I didn't think I'd get to see you for a couple more days." Leaning forward, her nimble fingers worked to loosen his tie. "I've been on the phone all afternoon with the Preservation Society," she said, as if it had been the most unpleasant experience that one could have. But then she smiled coyly up at him, and her eyes twinkled. "I told them that I wasn't sure, but that I thought that maybe, hopefully, possibly, Stella, that you were considering implementing, Stella, their design plans." "Stella." Leonardo's hand covered hers where she was still playing with his tie. She glanced into his eyes, and it was as if the reverie in her ended within that very moment of life. She pulled away by sitting up straight, but Leonardo managed to keep her hand in his. "You're not going to go with the Preservation Society's plans at all, are you?" Leonardo shook his head, but he did not let his gaze waver from her face. He needed to see her thoughts as they flickered through her eyes. "God, I can't. There are too many forces at work against it. The cost of going with the Preservation Society's plans would be in the tens of millions after everything was considered. I can't do it, Stella. The Romano del Mare, she's just a building. A beautiful building, see, but just a building. She's not worth jeopardizing my family name, wealth, and reputation for." Stella nodded her head, but Leonardo could see that her mind was stumbling to keep up with the shift in events.
Leonardo, please, if you would just reconsider. My boss, he's hell-bent on making an example out of your monastery. Please, Leo, reconsider. Maybe the design plans can be merged. Maybe you can preserve sections of the monastery in its original state.
Leonardo shook his head no, but he softened the rejection by lifting her hand to his mouth to kiss it. But it wasn't enough. Stella got up from the sofa and paced the small room from one end to the other, mumbling to herself in broken thoughts that didn't make much sense to Leonardo.
Stella, come, sit.
He patted the spot next to him.
It will be okay. I still have you, and you still have me.
Stella stopped in her tracks, turned to him, and said,
I need you to go. Right now. You have to go.
Leonardo's head snapped back, as if he'd been struck, for, in fact, he had. Stella's words could not have hurt him more if she had delivered them with a baseball bat.
Stella, go!
Her arm shot up to point the way to the door.
There are more people in the world than you know, you know? There are other things to consider besides your family, your money, and your reputation.
Leonardo stood, and as he did, he left his sentiment behind, as a wall of hard, cold rock erected itself around his heart. He didn't reach for her, didn't speak to her. He simply walked out through her door and closed it behind him. The veil between her feelings for him and her desire to see the Romano del Mare transformed into a design that fit her vision was thinner than he had ever thought. He meant nothing to her beyond getting her own way. Leonardo drove the winding roads of Sicily for hours that night until the light of dawn made the sky glow softly, contrasting with the earth below that was still heavily blanketed in shadow. By the time the sun had crested the world's edge to light the land itself, Leonardo was back at his office and sitting behind his desk. An hour after that, papers were delivered by courier. Cease and desist papers. Thumbing through them, he saw Stella's signature on more than one of the appended documents. Per sanctions already ready to be put into effect by their hand delivery, all restoration of the Romano del Mare was to stop immediately. Furthermore, the ancient monastery was being reclassified as a historic monument. It would never open its doors as a resort again. There was no way to recoup the millions that had been sunk into its repair, and the management of the resort would be turned over to Sicily's local preservation society, though the property itself would continue to be owned by the Romano family. All the air in Leonardo's office left. He called the restoration foreman to his office and gave the news. He then called his brothers and did the same. Then Leonardo stood up, put on his suit jacket, and left. But he didn't stop at the edge of the Romano del Mare property. He didn't even stop at the edge of the neighboring town. In fact, he didn't even stop at the edge of the continent. He kept going. He turned his back on all of the deceit that had weaseled its way into his heart, and he didn't look back. Chapter 10. Stella.
What do you mean you don't know where he is?
Stella's voice was pinched and strained as she turned in a circle within Leonardo's office, her eyes scanning the walls and shelves, as if the office itself held the answer to where Leonardo had disappeared to.
You're his brother. You're supposed to know where he is.
It had taken 2 days before Stella had gotten over her anger enough to take any phone calls from the Preservation Society or to reach out to Leonardo. By the time she had, the whole world had turned upside down, and Leonardo hadn't been heard from by anyone. When Stella learned what had happened, that the Romano del Mare had been reclassified as a historical monument, everything changed for her in that instance, and her alliance shifted. No longer was she willing to do the bidding of a heavy-handed organization with an agenda that tended to be more about flexing its own muscle and getting its own way, rather than preserving ancient buildings. Now, the Romano del Mare's doors were to be closed as a resort forever. She had never wanted things to go so far. She'd written the argument to rezone the Romano del Mare as a historic monument 2.5 months before she'd ever set foot in Sicily. She'd been given an assignment, and she'd done it. She hadn't visited it. She hadn't seen it with her own eyes. To her, then, it had only been an ancient building whose owners weren't respecting it, who were attempting to make it into something that it wasn't. She didn't feel that way now, though, and she was willing to do something about it. The Romano del Mare needed people. It had thrived as a resort less than 2 decades ago.
She'd seen the pictures, and it had been beautiful. The brothers had simply taken the renovation too far by adding what they'd thought was needed to entice the tourists of today. But if they kept the design elements simple, in order to allow the beauty of the original structure to shine through, the tourists would still come. And they would love it here, just as she now did. "I am sorry," Jean-Pierre said over the phone. "When my brother does not want to be found, there is no finding him. He goes when he needs a break, and he comes back when he's ready." Still a bit down on her frustration. She didn't want to alienate herself from the family of a man whom she cared deeply about. "And you have no idea, none at all, as to where he might have gone?" She needed him. If she was going to set things right, she had to have his help. "No, I'm sorry." Stella ended the call with a heavy heart. Moving behind Leonardo's desk, she sat down in his chair with a weariness that had sunk its way into her bones. She had not felt this worn out and used up since the days of spending months at a time in the hospital. Swiveling his chair around so that it faced the window, Stella stared out onto the grounds surrounding the monastery. She couldn't give up. She knew that, but she didn't know what to do, and a fear that she had lost the battle to save the Romano del Mare settled into the pit of her stomach. "Leonardo, where are you?" she murmured to herself. His brothers and their girlfriends didn't know where he was. His assistant didn't know where he was, and she'd even intercepted a call from his chief designer. Nobody knew where he was. Her eyes drifted away from the serene beauty of the Sicilian landscape to float across the knickknacks in his office. She had already searched through every drawer of his desk, and, under great duress, his assistant had even given her access to his computer and email. The man had disappeared, and it was all her fault. If she'd found a better approach, if she'd realized what the Preservation Society's next move would be, maybe she could have stopped it. At the very least, she could have warned Leonardo about the risks. "He's got to be in one of his hotels," she said to herself. He could have given strict orders to tell no one of his presence, and he could be going under a different name. When a man like him owned dozens of hotels around the world, how difficult could it really be to disappear? She could make a list, check them off one by one. Niccolo had said that Leonardo had probably flown on a public airline because he hadn't borrowed Niccolo's private jet. So she could call the airlines and bribe someone to give her information. Or, at the very least, she could make a list of all outgoing available flights over the last few days. But then she thought of Italy, a mere ferry boat ride away. He could have gone there, and he could be there now. Or he could have gone anywhere. Pulling the stack of books from the corner of Leonardo's desk, she flipped through the glossy, printed, picture-laden design books one by one. There was one on the palaces of India, another one focused on the cathedrals of Italy. Then there were the castles of Germany. Her hand stopped as she reached for the next book. Cabins? All of the other books had been about larger-than-life locations, but the cover of this book was adorned by a simple one-story cabin that looked no more than 800 square feet large. There was nothing ornate or grand about it other than its simplicity and the beauty of its surroundings. She slid the book in front of her and began leafing through its pages. They were filled with everything from rustic cabins to cabins that would be better described as mansions. Then she noticed it, the inscription inside the book's front cover. "The Rocky Mountains are waiting. Enjoy the solitude." Scribbled beneath the inscription was a messily scrawled name. E. Podesco? Mboleski? She stared at the name, doing her best to decipher it. Finally, she pulled up the internet on Leonardo's computer and started searching. She put in cabin, Rocky Mountains, and plugged in every variation of the signature that she could think of. Finally, she struck gold. Frank Poslenski. She clicked on the man's website and started to read. He was an architect who specialized in cabins within the Colorado area. "The Rocky Mountains," Stella whispered to herself as she Googled the location of the Rocky Mountains that cut through the state of Colorado. A smile grew, at first tentative, but soon energized and full of hope. "Bianca," she called out for Leonardo's assistant. The young woman appeared in the doorway a moment later. "Did you find him?" she asked, with hopeful eagerness. "Not yet, but I'm getting closer. Does Leonardo have any connections with anyone in Colorado? In America? No, none that I know of. Stella pressed her lips together into a determined thin line. It doesn't matter, she said, standing up. That's where I'm going to. He's got to be there. Colorado? But that doesn't make any sense, Bianca said, with her eyes wide and full of shock.
Stella thought of her trip to the used bookstore with Leonardo, and how the shopkeeper had had books that he'd gotten in on special order for Leonardo. They'd been about the lore of the American Old West.
No, it makes perfect sense, Stella said, taking a deep, triumphant breath. I'm going to America to hunt down a Sicilian man in hiding.
She was going to save the Romano del Mare, and she was going to get Leonardo to help her do it. Chapter 11. Leonardo.
Stella!
Leonardo stared with near disbelief. When he'd heard the light knock at the door, he'd thought that maybe the local grocer was delivering the food he'd requested. He'd never dreamed that it would be the woman he'd turned his back on and walked away from. He'd relegated her to becoming a part of his past. To find her now in flesh and blood as part of his present required a moment for his brain to catch up with his new reality. He considered closing the door in her face, turning around, and leaving her in his past once and for all. But there was a look of hope laced with sadness in her eyes that he could not turn away from. A gust of chill early April wind blew past, and he saw Stella shiver. He was dressed in an oversized sweater, but she was still dressed in the lightweight, often gossamer-like clothes that she'd worn in Sicily. She didn't even have a coat on, and her naked toes peeked out from her barely bare sandals. He could tell she was doing her best to fight it, but she shivered again. Behind her, her cab was already driving away down the long gravel lane that wound its way down the mountain to the small town below. "You've left me no choice, have you?" he said with a hint of bitterness in his voice. If he turned her away, she'd probably be dead from exposure before she even reached the bottom of the mountain. "Come in." He stepped aside, wondering how he could have ever cared so much for a woman as manipulative as her. Stella's eyes widened at Leonardo's harsh words, then, seeming to pick up on his meaning, she glanced over her shoulder at the retreating cab. Turning back around to face him, she pulled her cell phone out of her little over-the-shoulder purse. "I can call the cab company. I can call him back. I can ask him to wait for me. But if you could just give me a few minutes, please." She didn't move from her spot on the threshold of his home, even though he'd moved aside, and had opened the door for her to come in. A stronger wind blew, and this time Leonardo actually heard her teeth chatter. "Woman!" he exclaimed in exasperation. "Come in now!" He grabbed her hand and led her into the house, ignoring the instant heat that flared in his body the moment his skin touched hers. His body still wanted her. Still holding onto her hand, he led her to the enormous open fireplace that sat in the middle of the cabin's great room. The cathedral ceiling was 30 feet high, and the towering fireplace hood, made of smooth river rock, climbed up through its top. "Stay," Leonardo said as he sat her down on the wide hearth surrounding the crackling fire. He returned a few minutes later with a mug of coffee-laced cocoa. "Drink this." He knew that it wasn't necessary. The chill seemed to have left Stella already, but when his hand brushed hers as she took the cup, it was still very cold. He sat down next to her and waited until she took a sip of the warm brew before pelting her with any questions. When she'd lowered the mug from her sweet, perfect lips that he ached to kiss, he lodged his attack. "How did you find me, and what do you want?" Stella winced, but then she gave a thin-lipped smile with steepled eyebrows. Her eyes were so full of regret that he had to stop his arms from wrapping around her and pulling her into him. "I messed up." A breath of tense air left Leonardo as his chest deflated. It was as if her wave of a white flag toppled all of his buttresses in one move. He hated that he still wanted her, and he despised himself for wanting to trust her. But intellectually, he was not willing to let her off the hook so easily. "So, you never meant to sign a report arguing the need to have the Romano del Mare reclassified as a historic monument? You never meant to cause my family to lose millions or for the resort's doors to be closed forever?" Stella nodded. "I did write and sign that report,
I did it almost 3 months ago before I ever got to Sicily. I thought that I was doing the right thing. My boss told me to research the property. I did. But I made an argument to them that the monastery's original design could still be honored even if used as a resort. They told me I could come and make the pitch to you, but I should have told you that they had plans to take things further if I failed. To be honest, I didn't know what they would do. There were 8 or 9 contingency plans, and the one they went with was reserved as a last resort. I'm shocked that they did it, and I believe they were wrong. She took a deep breath, and Leonardo could see that she was emotionally bracing herself. Leo, I messed up.
Leo. It was what she'd called him at the beach as they'd made love. His mind railed against her words, convinced that she was manipulating him yet again, but his heart reached for her and did not care whether she was good for him or not.
But I can fix it.
The two sides of Leonardo's feuding self stopped their internal struggle with Stella's final words.
What? I can fix this. I can make it right. We can get the cease and desist overturned. I know it. We just need to...
Stop. Leonardo stood and stepped away from the fireplace as he shoved his hands deep into the pockets of his jeans. Turning, he faced her. Her expression was full of confused anticipation and, yes, even hope. But he wanted none of it. He was done. He'd been done the second he'd walked out of his office after receiving the court order to stop all of the renovation activities. I've put that behind me. It's done. The Romano del Mare has taken up too much of my energy and too much of my family's resources. But that's over. I'm severing my involvement with my family's investment in that property. There's no going back. There's only moving forward. Stella's cheeks colored a soft pink, the color of cherry blossoms. She'd never looked more beautiful to him, despite the pain he saw in her eyes.
You left it behind.
And me too. She'd finally put it together. He'd had no intention of ever seeing her again. She was the past, and there was no room for her in his future. Until that moment, his emotions had been in turmoil, but he felt himself cool toward her. He felt himself shut down so that he could manage her with the same intellectual aloofness that permeated all of his major life decisions. How did you find me? He needed to know. This was his one sanctuary from all of the demands that had accompanied overseeing a billion-dollar empire. But the place he retreated to when he needed to recharge had been invaded by the world he'd wanted to leave behind, left him devoid of any goodwill for the one who had done the invading. He needed to know that no one else would be attempting a repeat performance.
There was a book on your desk about log cabins, and there was an inscription in the front of the book by the architect of this place. I tracked him down. I told him,
she swallowed hard.
I told him that I was pregnant and that my family medical history required us to make a decision fast.
Leonardo's world tilted off its axis as everything in his life changed, and he stared agape-mouthed at her before finally finding his voice. You're pregnant? It was more an exclamation than a question. His heart pounded against the inside of his chest at all of the ramifications. The wonderful, magnificent ramifications, he realized. But then the world jerked to a halt as the rest of her words crashed their way through his mind, obliterating all other thoughts along the way. Medical history, and we have to decide fast? His heart plummeted into his stomach, and he thought he might be physically sick. No, Stella said, waving her hand frantically in front of her as if to wipe away the words that she'd spoken before. I just told him that so that he'd tell me where I could find you. He wouldn't even admit to knowing you at first. Her voice fell and took on the tone of someone who was utterly defeated. He was completely loyal to you. I had to trick him to get him to tell me where you were. The sick feeling that threatened to overwhelm Leonardo didn't go away. He'd gone from near fatherhood to having to make the worst decision of his life to not being a father at all within the blink of an eye. He hadn't even known that he wanted to be a father until that second. He'd thought that it was a path for other men, but not him. But Stella's simple ruse had completely dispelled that illusion. Not knowing what else to do with himself, he sat back down next to Stella. He'd felt fine before she'd arrived, but within minutes of having her back in his life, he felt as though he'd gone 3 rounds in a ring with a heavyweight champion. How could a woman like her ever be good for him to have in his life? Do you think we could go skiing? Stella asked in a small voice. Huh? He asked, shifting his attention to her. I noticed that some of the ski slopes were still open. I never imagined they'd be open this late in the season. And I've never been. You want to go skiing? Leonardo repeated. He still felt numb and didn't know how he should respond to her simple request. It seemed easy enough. Spend a day outside in the sun with a girl who had once captured his heart. The past is behind us, you're right. I agree, but I don't want to use that as an excuse to sit idly while my life passes by. She took a deep breath. I want to live every moment. She laid her hand over his and curled her fingers over his palm. His mind considered forcing his body to pull away, but his hand overruled it when he gave her fingers a squeeze. Skiing sounds nice, he said, smiling. But first, we've got to get you some proper clothes. Chapter 12. Stella. Stella squealed in gleeful delight as she hurtled down the ski slope at a ground-eating pace of 4 miles an hour. She hadn't worked out the mechanics of stopping yet, and she opened her arms wide to lose herself in a giant bear hug from Leonardo. But unlike all the other times they'd tried this maneuver, this time her feet kept going and she fell backwards to the snowy ground and pulled Leonardo down on top of her. She laughed so hard that tears threatened to freeze at the corners of her eyes. Oh, that was fun, she exclaimed, looking up into Leonardo's smiling face. His brilliantly blue eyes were crinkled, and he seemed a completely different man than the person she'd known in Sicily. He was lighthearted, carefree, and happy. He still liked to be in control on matters that he thought important, though, a fact shown by how he'd dressed her in thickly padded winter clothes that made her feel as if she were a walking marshmallow. Leonardo rested his weight on one elbow as he stretched out beside her. On the kiddie slopes that they were on, there was very little risk that anyone would come crashing into them. Stella tilted her head back to open herself to Leonardo's kiss as he dipped his head to capture her lips. She curled her gloved fingers into his coat, and would have curled her toes, too, if her boots would have allowed for that. They'd spent the better part of a week together so far, sharing every waking moment. But the tingles that the man gave her every time he touched her hadn't gone away. They hadn't even diminished. And, not for the first time, Stella wondered if she could have finally found love. But despite that, and regardless of what Leonardo had said about the past being behind them and having no place in their present or future, or the fact that she'd agreed with him, Stella didn't feel good about leaving parts of her past unfinished. She knew that the Romano del Mare could be restored to the grand resort it once was, while still honoring the unique beauty of its heritage. She wasn't ready to give up, and she had to figure out how to convince Leonardo that it was still a battle worth fighting. Let's do dinner at home tonight, Leonardo said, rubbing the tip of his nose back and forth over hers. I'll cook for you. Only if we can have dessert first, Stella teased, wiggling her brows suggestively, and then laughing when Leonardo gave her bottom lip a little nip. The drive back to the cabin was as picturesque as anything Stella had ever seen. Even though she was from America, she'd never visited the West, and had certainly never been to the Rocky Mountains. They were grander than anything she'd ever imagined, but by the time they reached the cabin, all of her attention had shifted to Leonardo. Stay, Leonardo ordered, as he got out of the driver's side and walked around to her side. Opening the door, he scooped her up into his arms. It never ceased to surprise her how strong he was. She felt safe and secure, resting against the wall of muscle that was his chest, and she kissed and nibbled his ear as he carried her into the house, doing her best to stroke her ego as she tried to distract him with her feminine wiles. But the only thing she managed to do was elicit a low growl from him. Letting her feet swing to the ground, he pressed her against the wall. Without hesitation, Stella began pulling his open coat off his shoulders as Leonardo worked to release her from hers. In under a minute, his discarded coat was joined by his shirt, and Stella dragged her nails down his thick pecs, earning her another growl from him
before he captured her wrists and pinned them above her head against the door.
Sorry, readers. Here's where we fade to black due to YouTube explicit content guidelines. If you dream for the steam, you'll need to take a look in the book.
It was an hour later before the two lay sated in front of a crackling fire in the middle of the grand room. Leonardo had laid out a plush wool rug that was nearly as thick and cushioned as laying on a thin mattress pad, yet insanely more luxurious. With her head on his shoulder, she traced invisible designs on his chest with her fingertips. "I see you're thinking," he said as he ran his fingers over her arm.
Hmm?
She said, smiling as she propped herself up on her elbow in order to better see him.
I was just thinking about how amazing it is to be here with you.
"Did it surprise you, Gara? Because it surprised me," Leonardo chuckled.
And to think you were willing to leave me behind without a glance back,
Stella teased. Leonardo shrugged. "Sometimes it is best to cut your losses." Stella waited for Leonardo to say something more to soften his words, but nothing came. She stared at him, laying with his eyes closed as he rested, and thought that maybe he hadn't meant to be so dismissive of what they almost hadn't had together. She had liked spending time with him, and she liked him, maybe even a little bit more than liked him. He had a piece of her heart now that she was never going to get back, and for her heart was a precious thing indeed.
Cut your losses, like with the Romano del Mare?
She waited to see if Leonardo's body would stiffen as his muscles tensed with unexpressed feelings at the unfinished business that had been left behind. But he didn't. He stayed completely relaxed.
Could he really have simply let it go, as if it had never mattered?
The thought gave her a chill. If he could shut off his feelings about the landmark property that had galvanized the Romano name with international fame, a property that had been in his family for generations, then how easy would it be for him to shut his feelings for her off? After all, he'd already done it once. He'd walked away from her with plans to never see her again without even so much as a word goodbye or a chance to let her explain herself. She'd never even considered that he could do it to her again, that he could leave her again with the same ease and emotional theatrics as quietly closing a door. As she sank back down to rest her head on his shoulder, Leonardo's arm wrapped around her to snuggle her into his side. But Stella didn't feel its warmth. It had gone cold to her, just as Leonardo's once warm heart had done. Leonardo wasn't the man she'd imagined he was. She'd made a mistake. Again. Chapter 13. Leonardo. Leonardo walked barefoot through his house with a glass of bourbon in each hand. Whenever he was in the States, he always opted for bourbon rather than wine, choosing to go with a famous drink native to the country he was in. Ever since their night together in front of the fireplace a couple of days ago, Stella had cooled to him. He could feel the distance between them even more when they were in the same room together, and he needed to know why. If she was homesick, all she needed to do was say so, and if she wanted him there, they could relocate together to her place in Connecticut to finish out his vacation. It didn't matter to him where they were. He simply enjoyed being with her. Glancing around the great room, he didn't spot her, but then he noticed a glow coming from his cracked open office door on the far side of the room. Instead of calling out to her, he padded silently over the hardwood floor and then tapped on the door to his own office. Even though it was his space, he had no intentions of intruding, but what he saw stopped him in his tracks. Stella was sitting at his L-shaped desk with her laptop open and its screen visible from the doorway. When he knocked, she gave a startled jump and then immediately tried to close the various windows she had opened before finally giving up and closing the laptop's lid altogether. "What's that about?" Leonardo asked. The words Romano del Mare had burned themselves into his retinas from the glaring computer screen within the dimly lit room, not so much because they had been so bright, but because he was determined to put that part of his life behind him. Everything about it was like an open wound to him. He had failed that monastery so many times over. As the eldest grandson, he wished that his grandfather had entrusted him with the resort's management instead of signing it over to a management company, one that ultimately ran it into ruin. Then, when he realized that something wasn't right about the way the property was being handled, he should have put aside his own pursuits to build a Romano chain of hotels and turned his attention to the place he'd visited so many times as a child under his grandparents' care. His father had died young, and his mother had been absent in his life, but the old monastery and his grandparents had always been there. It sliced like a dagger in his stomach that he had failed it. "Why can't you leave that alone?" Leonardo challenged, his voice coming out harsher than he had intended. But it was a true testament to the anger that roiled inside of him. "You agreed it was best left in the past." Stella's lips thinned, and she crossed her arms over her chest as she slouched down in his office chair. She seemed unmoved by his demand to know why she couldn't leave the past in the past. "What's been up with you? You've barely spoken to me in 2 days. Now this? I thought we were having a good time here." Anger was quickly turning into the bitterness of betrayal. He'd come here to get away from all of that. She was the one who had invaded his privacy, his sanctuary, and now she felt justified to just sit there and... what? Judge him? How could she even begin to understand the loss that he was struggling to come to terms with? The only way he could find peace within it all was to give himself the space he needed to let go of what was beyond his control. Some battles cost too much to fight regardless of whether you won. Couldn't she see that? It was better to walk away. "This," Stella motioned to her closed laptop, "is why I came here. The Romano del Mare needs people. If it gets closed down to be some empty, dusty ruin for people to walk past and view behind velvet ropes, she'll never be the glorious place that she once was. I see it now. I get it. I didn't understand it before when I was sitting at my desk halfway around the world writing that cease and desist argument. I did this. I messed things up. And I have to try to fix it. I don't want 10 or 15 years to slip by with my biggest regret in life being that I stood by and did nothing when there was still a chance to set things right." Leonardo shook his head. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "So this," he waved a hand in the direction of her computer, "was what it was all about? You didn't come here to see me or to be with me. You just needed to soothe your own conscience. It was never about me. It was only about using me." Bile wanted to crawl up his throat and coat his mouth with the extreme distaste he felt for Stella within that moment. "I'm not doing this. Not again. I told you that within minutes of you showing up, uninvited, on my doorstep. I told you that I was putting it all in the past. Nothing has changed. There comes a time when you have to cut your losses and walk away, and the Romano del Mare has reached that point. It's a lost cause." Stella stood from Leonardo's desk chair. She was tiny before him, but her spirit was bold. He hated that. Even then, he found her undeniably to be the most beautiful woman he had ever known. But she used him again. The first time was when she tried to seduce him into letting her have her own way with the resort's design, no doubt to further her own career. And then this time, she'd tracked him down halfway around the world to rub salt in the wounds that she herself had created. "It's not a lost cause," Stella said in a voice that was both pleading and confronting. "I wrote the argument that was used to rezone the Romano del Mare, and I can build an argument to refute it. I know I can. But I need your help." "No. No way. Go back to your boss. Tell him the game is up. Whatever it is that you two are trying to play. It's done. It's over. I quit. You've gotten your way. Now it's time to move on." "Boss? There's no boss. There hasn't been since 2 weeks before you turned your back on everything. He wanted me to move forward with the cease and desist weeks ago, but I refused. I made excuses to delay it first, and finally he told me to do it or I was fired." She shrugged. "You can figure out the rest. All of this. This work, this effort, it's been to protect you and to protect the Romano del Mare. I knew that if I could get you to make concessions toward the Preservation Society's design plans, that it would make it harder for them to take any action against you or the resort. But," she shrugged, "when you decided to stay with your original design of covering up almost all of the natural elements within the monastery, I knew it was throwing the door wide open for their lawyers to win whatever case that they wanted to push." She shook her head. "Leonardo, I'm sorry. I tried to tell you. I tried to help you.
I just didn't know how to get you to consider a way that might have worked for everyone involved.
Leonardo couldn't believe what he was hearing. That she couldn't see past the resort, and her own agenda was proof that she operated by only what was in front of her face. And that was a luxury he didn't have. Too many lives depended on every decision he made. Every time he said yes or no to anything pertaining to Romano International, his mind reeled at the real-life implications for people he might only meet once or twice in his lifetime. They were unseen, but not forgotten, not by him. Do you really think everything is that simple? That the only people that exist within this situation are me, you, the resort, and the Preservation Society? Are you that naive? By going with your plans, the Romano hotels were poised to lose millions all around the world. I wouldn't have liked that. My brothers wouldn't have liked it. But the people who would have been devastated by it are the career employees who have been working for me and my family for years. People would have lost their livelihoods, Stella, and sometimes in areas of the world where there aren't any better jobs around. Your short-sightedness almost cost hundreds of people more dearly than you could ever know. Shock registered on Stella's face. I didn't know. Of course you didn't. All you could see was what was right in front of your face, and nothing past it or to the side. I don't have that luxury. Stella shook her head. No, there has to be a way. The monastery is almost 1,000 years old. Stella. There was a warning in Leonardo's voice. Put it in the past and let it go. Or let me go. You can't have us both. Stella's cheeks turned pink and she blinked several times as her mouth opened and closed. Finally, in a voice that Leonardo almost didn't hear, she said, I'll pack my things. When she walked out of the room, Leonardo wanted to grab her and pull her into him, but he forced himself not to. They were at an impasse, and it was time for him to take his own advice. It was time for him to let Stella go. Chapter 14. Stella. Stella pulled her favorite fluffy blanket closer around where she sat up curled on the couch. It had been the one she'd always liked to snuggle up in when she was sick as a kid, and she hadn't been able to bear the thought of letting it go after she got her new heart. Instead, she had it vacuum sealed, and she tucked it away with the hope that she'd never need it again. And while life had not always been easy, even after getting a new ticker to put some spring back into her step, she'd managed to get by all these years without it. Until now. Scooping a huge spoonful of Ben & Jerry's chocolate chip cookie dough ice cream into her mouth, she sighed as she let it slowly melt. On the TV in front of her played Working Girl with Melanie Griffith, opposite Harrison Ford, a story about a woman with vision who'd had to lie about who she was to get anyone to take her ideas seriously. You tell him, girl, Stella spouted off at the screen as Melanie's character pitted herself against her crooked boss. If she'd had a foam toy to throw at the screen, she would have. Next to her on the couch sat her laptop, open but untouched for hours. That was because she'd spent the last 8 hours scouring through every available posting worldwide with any office even slightly resembling a preservation society. How could I have been so clueless? She lamented. She'd been wrong about the Romano del Mare. She'd thought she'd known so much. Had thought that she understood everything that she'd needed to understand. But it wasn't until she had visited the monastery and had seen its halls and how much vibrancy, even just having the workers there brought to it, that she'd realized the ancient place needed people. It needed to be lived in, not passively idolized by people looking at its crumbling structure in books or walking over its grounds on a day tour. She'd messed up, and now she had no way of making it right. On top of that, she didn't have a job, and any inquiries she'd made with other agencies had quickly soured as soon as they'd learned her name. Her ex-boss had been calling all of the agencies up and muddying the waters, making her unemployable. She was sure of it, but she didn't know how to prove it or how to do anything about it. Her phone beeped with an incoming text. Checking it, she saw that it was from Luciana, Jean-Pierre's girlfriend. Have you heard from him yet? Stella had told Leonardo's family that she'd seen him and that he was fine. But she didn't tell them any more than that until she'd finally confessed to Luciana that she and Leonardo had a fight to end all fights. Their romance was dead. When she'd told Luciana, the lovely woman who had captured Jean-Pierre's heart wouldn't accept it. She'd said the Romano men were hard-headed, but made up for it by being unfalteringly warm-hearted. But Stella knew that that only meant that Luciana didn't know Leonardo at all. The man's heart was as cold as a dead fish.
Then why do you miss him so much?
Picking up her phone, she texted Luciana back. No, nothing. Luciana sent back, hugs, plus added a heart. Stella huffed another heart-aching sigh, and then took another bite of her ice cream. She felt like a teenager, devastated to find out that the boy she'd had a crush on didn't like her back. Her chest hurt, physically hurt. She rubbed at her scar until her chest was pink, but it hadn't helped at all. She fantasized about getting drunk, just so that she'd have something to blame it on when she drunk-dialed Leonardo, to both give him a piece of her mind and to break down in sobs at how much he'd broken her heart. Ben & Jerry's ice cream and every romantic comedy she could find were the only things stopping her from doing just that. A knock sounded at her apartment door, and Stella froze mid-chew, with the spoon halfway down to the ice cream container. Things could have gotten worse, she realized. She could now be having auditory hallucinations. The knock sounded again, this time a little bit louder, and a little bit longer. Stella got up from the couch so fast that Ben & Jerry was knocked on the floor, forgotten, and then she tripped with her feet tangled up in her blanket. She didn't take a moment to see if she was okay, but instead kicked it off as fast as she could and scrambled back up to her feet so that she could run headlong for the door. Putting her eye up to the peephole, she was stunned to see a very tired Bianca standing in her hall. Of course, the woman was as stunning as ever, tired or not. Sliding the door chain's lock open and then turning two deadbolts, Stella threw her door open.
Bianca!
Without waiting for an invitation, she threw her arms around the woman and pulled her in for a tight hug. There was a slight hesitation of awkwardness from Bianca, but then she gave Stella a warm hug back. Pulling away, but keeping her hands on Bianca's arms, Stella asked in a rush of breath,
Is Leonardo okay? Are you okay? Is Leonardo okay?
She blushed, knowing she'd asked about Leonardo first and twice. But she hadn't been able to keep the words from tumbling out of her mouth. Bianca's eyes dropped away, and she looked as though she was embarrassed. Finally, she said,
I'm not allowed to give you any information about him.
What? Stella's hands fell away from Bianca. Her voice was full of hurt and rejection. There was no masking it.
No, I am sorry, but I have brought you these.
Bianca motioned down the hallway, and Stella stuck her head out through the door to see what she was waving at. She gaped at the sight of a large, burly man pushing a mover's dolly in front of him. On it was piled 4 very heavy-looking boxes. And behind that man were 3 more men, each one with a dolly loaded down with boxes.
They are from Leonardo's computer, along with historical papers from the Romano del Mare's own vaults, Stella,
Bianca said, pulling Stella's attention back to her.
There are originals in those boxes, some of them hundreds of years old. You must be very careful, and you must return these files to me. Do you understand?
Stella mutely nodded her head.
When you are done with them, you call me. Wherever I am, I will fly here and get the papers back from you. Capizio?
Stella nodded her head, letting Bianca know that she did understand. She stepped out of the way as the men filed through her door and unloaded the heavy boxes. Thinking quickly, she instructed them to set all the boxes side by side along the wall instead of putting them on top of each other. As strong as the men were, she could see their muscles bunch as they moved the boxes around, and she didn't want to run the risk of toppling them over or spilling all their contents on the floor. The men left just as they'd come, without uttering a word, but Stella caught Bianca's arm before she left. Possibly there was no one who knew Leonardo better than his assistant.
Is there anything you can tell me? Anything at all?
Stella hated the pleading need that was in her voice, but she was too far past caring what anyone thought of her. If she could only hear Leonardo's voice again, or feel the brush of his fingers on her cheek, she could once more feel whole. Bianca shook her head and started to walk away, but then stopped.
Pursing her lips, her eyes moved about, as if she were searching for just the right words to say. He would whistle in his office when no one was around while you were there, and he doesn't whistle anymore now. And, she added with a stern, steely gaze, I did not say that. Capiscu? Capiscu, Stella said, throwing her arms around the woman for another hug, but this time her heart was light with hope. Not only was she getting a second chance to save the Romano del Mare, but Leonardo's cold-fish heart had some life left in it, after all. Chapter 15. Leonardo. Fluted glasses full of pink champagne clinked as everyone in attendance celebrated Leonardo's words as he stood before his family. To my new sister, he said with his gaze on Adeline, Niccolò's fiancée, as he raised his glass high into the air from where he stood at the head of the table. And the newest addition to the Romano family that she is due to bring into this world. Her belly had grown round and full, and Leonardo smiled as Niccolò and Adeline linked fingers over her belly as he leaned in for a kiss. Adeline was beyond beautiful right now. She had the radiant pregnancy glow that came with motherhood, and Leonardo could think of only one woman more beautiful than her at that moment. Stella. Since the moment that Stella had walked out of his home in Colorado and had climbed into the waiting cab that would take her down the mountain, his heart had felt both achingly empty and agonizingly heavy at the same time. He'd lingered there in Colorado without her in his huge vacant house for another week and a half after she'd left. Strike that. After he'd thrown her out, determined to recapture his sense of centered happiness that he had always been able to attain within solitude. But she'd stolen that tranquility from him. He was an empty man without her. No, that wasn't quite right, he thought, as he looked out over his family. Instead of having lost what they'd held most precious to them before having met the loves of their lives, both of his brothers' worlds had grown exponentially when they'd accepted the love of a woman who only wanted the best for them. Niccolò was a better man 10 times over since Adeline had grounded him from his continent hopping and had made him understand the value of setting down roots. And Jean-Pierre's laser-fixed passion for the restoration of medieval architecture had softened to make room for more of the joy and happiness that life had to offer. Sitting between him and Luciana was Luciana's niece and ward, and the love that the three shared for each other made the room grow brighter just by having them there. I want that. It was a startling revelation. Leonardo had known that he was lonely without Stella, but now he saw that what he was mourning was not only her absence from his life, but their future life together. So full of love, that had died when he'd made her choose between him and her integrity. And, of course, she had chosen her integrity. It was the kind of woman she was. She was passionate, honest, sincere, gentle, and kind, and he'd been the biggest moron to have ever lived when he'd pushed her away. He'd found her handwritten notes detailing the argument that she'd been crafting to free the Romano del Mare from the Preservation Society's reclassification. He'd recognized how wrong he was to demand that she give up a battle that was, for her, not done. Now, he had to figure out a way to get her back. Whatever he did, he knew that he had to go big. He could rent a yacht with plans for them to tour the Mediterranean coastline, or he could appeal to her adventurous side by arranging a small brigade of air balloons. He could avow his eternal love to her while they floated through the sky over the most beautiful country in the world, Sicily. Or, possibly, he could simply show up on her doorstep, on his knee, holding up a ring with the question he should have already asked. Would she be his wife? Sitting back down in his chair and looking out over his expanding family, Leonardo knew that he had messed up. Now, he had to figure out how to make it right. Just as Stella was willing to continue to fight for the Romano del Mare, no matter what the cost, he would continue to fight for her. And this time, there was no price tag. There was no amount too steep. He would not measure the risk against the benefit. Not anymore. For her, he would lose everything, because without her, he had nothing. Chapter 16. Stella.
Stella stood before 4 men and 1 woman, the council of the Sicilian Historic Society. It felt odd to be standing on Sicilian soil again, since this was where she'd lost her heart to the only man she'd ever truly loved. His rejection of her was a conscious part of her being during every moment of every day. Not a breath or a second passed that her skin didn't ache for his touch, or her ears didn't reach for the sound of his voice. But neither ever came. Acceptance that she'd lost him had come slowly and painfully, but it had come. Despite that, a flicker of hope still danced in her heart like a little flame. But it was tiny, and the beliefs that fueled it were being burned off one by one, so that soon even it would die. It had taken her 3 weeks to comb through the boxes and boxes of material sent by Leonardo to her home, and it had taken her another week to craft her final argument, one that presented a solid body of evidence that the Romano del Mare's continued classification as the landmark resort that had become known the world over should be upheld and supported by the Sicilian Historic Society. Their ruling had the power to overturn the court order pushed through by the International Preservation Society to reclassify the old monastery as a historic monument. She'd shown in her argument how many historic buildings had fallen into decline through years of disuse, and she'd contrasted the rare and fantastic condition that the nearly 1,000-year-old building was in still today. And it was because of the careful upkeep and maintenance that had been performed on the building by generations of the Romano family. In addition to that, the monastery's continuing function as a resort provided a much-needed and long-term economic boost to the region. She'd demonstrated how the region had suffered in the 2 decades since it had closed its doors as an international hub of commerce and travel, and she'd demonstrated the cultural loss that had occurred when the Romano del Mare closed its doors as a resort as well. Generations of families had vacationed there year after year, not to mention wedding festivities and the hosting of many local government celebrations and gatherings. Despite all of that, Stella would be lying if she said she wasn't nervous now. Only 3 days had passed since she'd presented her argument, and the council that sat before her on their raised dais behind a long table looked upon her now with long, stern faces. She searched their eyes, but saw no hint of their decision. The cost of pursuing the reinstatement of the monastery for commercial use had been the loss of her happiness and possibly the loss of an entire life with a magnificent man to stand by her side. She'd bartered it all away for this. She'd spared nothing. Now, she needed to know that her efforts were not in vain. Though, to be honest with herself, it didn't fully matter if they were in vain. She'd done what she'd had to do. She had chosen to live her life hands-on and to face its hardships head-on, rather than to live a life of careful passivity. And she'd do it all again in the blink of an eye. She had to. She'd been given this new heart as a second chance, and there was no way that she was going to squander that chance by living a life dictated by fear. A single elegant woman on the council, sitting in the middle of the dais between the stately and aged men, cleared her voice, and when she spoke, she thankfully did so in English, out of an apparent kindness to allow Stella the chance to keep up with what she had to say. "We are indebted to you." Stella's heart pounded in a staccato double time as her mind connected with the councilwoman's words, and she fought against the smile that wanted to light her face. Nothing definitive had been said yet, and she did not want to appear presumptuous by assuming that her argument had succeeded in saving the Romano del Mare's life as a resort to be enjoyed by all. "We did not want to uphold the cease and desist presented to us by the International Preservation Society. We find them heavy-handed in thinking that they know what is best with regard to preserving the heritage of other countries." She glanced down at her notes before lifting her gaze to look at Stella again. "When the original argument came through, we found it compelling, even though it did not match our desires. Regardless, we cannot turn our backs on the logic it made. I understand that it is you who wrote both the first argument to strip away the Romano del Mare's classification as a commercial property, and it is you who penned the argument to overturn the first request." "Yes, ma'am," Stella said, feeling tiny beads of sweat break out on her brow as her chest got tighter and tighter. But as the woman before her smiled, transforming her entire visage from an authoritarian into a person with a passion for life,
Stella's breath returned, and a glow of happiness took root inside of her. The councilwoman nodded. I am glad. You have done a good thing. Thank you. Lifting a gavel, she hit the table with a loud bang. Then, with a lifted voice that filled the giant, spacious room, she decreed, The property defined as the Romano del Mare shall be returned to its status as a commercial holding, so long as its owners strive to show respect to the property's structures as being of landmark value for the Sicilian people. Her gavel slammed down again, with a finality that was music to Stella's ears. Stella's flight back to the States was scheduled for the day after tomorrow. With every second that ticked past, she fought the urge to seek Leonardo out. She didn't know whether he was in Sicily or not. She didn't even know if his family had heard about the overturning of the ruling from late that morning. She only knew that she wanted to see Leonardo again, but couldn't allow herself that luxury. She would throw herself at him, tell him that she wanted to be with him. But that wasn't really true. She'd fallen in love with a man who didn't exist. She projected onto him her own values, those of a generous heart and a zest for life that didn't falter just because the going got tough. Yet despite that, her body, mind, and spirit all called to him. She had never laughed so freely with anyone but him, and when they had moved their bodies together in a dance designed to lift them to the very heights of bliss, she had felt herself become one with him. One mind, one spirit, one body. In every way, he had been the best time of her life, and she missed him. She missed his friendship and how easy it was to be near him without the need to constantly fill the silence. He made her comfortable, and oh so happy. But that time of her life was done, and taking a page from Leonardo's playbook, she was putting her relationship with him behind her. She was letting it go. So why am I standing at the Romano del Mare? She sighed heavily, accepting the truth about herself. She was not ready to let Leonardo go, no matter how much she told herself that she should. But to soothe the ache of wanting to go to him, she would give herself the next best thing. Her memories. It was odd to be near the monastery, and for the old building to be silent. The ruling to allow the place to open once more as a resort had only come down that morning, and no work crews had yet resumed their restoration work. Walking around to the side of the building, Stella walked up the slope toward the pool and then veered to the side to the start of the path that she and Leonardo had walked together. It was lonelier than she had imagined it would be as she walked it alone. Possibly it was the fading sun as the day's light softened in preparation of becoming night. She would likely be caught in the dark on the walk back, but she didn't care. For now, following the path was easy, but if she got lost on the way back, she would return to the beach where Leonardo and she had first made love, and she would give herself the night to remember him, so that maybe, just maybe, she could burn her want of him clean from her soul with the rays of the morning sun. Determined to hold on to as much happiness as she could, she walked with a determined step and held her head high. But even with her quick pace, sure enough, the light was already fading when she reached the beach. In memory of what they had shared, she was tempted to strip off her clothes and bathe in the waters that were so welcoming as they lapped on the shore. The distant sound eased her pain as the memories of being in Leonardo's arms flooded her. Closing her eyes and soaking in everything the place had to give her, she was sure that she could even smell him as she took a deep breath. You do know this is a topless beach, don't you? A smooth, deep voice rolled over her from out of nowhere, causing her to jump and her eyes to pop open. Her neck twisted and turned as she spun around in search of its owner. Then she stopped when she'd spotted him. Leonardo. His name on her lips had only been a whisper, but it seared itself into his heart. She was every bit as beautiful as the last time he'd seen her, and he couldn't help but doubt his senses and think he might be dreaming. But the sound of his name on her lips shook him to his core so deeply that he knew he was either in heaven or the love of his life was standing right in front of him, and he decided to trust the latter. I shouldn't have let you go that day. I shouldn't have driven you away. This wasn't the way he'd wanted to do this. He'd heard from Luciana that Stella was back in Sicily,
and he'd started plans to turn their small beach into a sea of floating lanterns. 2 cello players would sit at the base of the cliff on the path side of the beach, and the petals of 1,000 flowers would adorn the beach along with wine and other decadent offerings, ready on hand to celebrate in the event that she said yes. He'd had it all planned, but none of it meant anything to him now. She was here, and that was all he needed. Now he hoped that she felt the same. "I didn't think you'd be here, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude, I'll go," Stella said as she turned to leave. "Wait!" The word came out from some primal need within himself, and his voice boomed through the space between them, strong enough to make Stella stop and turn to look at him. "I was wrong. I can accept whatever happens to the Romano del Mare, but I was wrong to ever give up on you. I should have supported your decision to continue to fight, no matter what the outcome. I chose myself, and I have regretted it every second of every day since." He stepped forward and took her hands in his, half expecting her to yank them away. But she didn't. "You're all that matters to me. All of the rest of this is going to come and go and eventually fall into the sea. And that's okay, because if I know that I have you, then my life is complete." He could see the pain that he'd caused in her eyes as she stared up at him. What he didn't see was trust, not yet, and he didn't want to give her a chance to shut him down before he'd said all that he needed to say. If she refused him after that, he could live with it. But if he held anything back about the way he felt about her, then he had truly failed. Dropping to one knee, he released one of her hands so that he could shove his own hand deep into his pocket. A moment later, he withdrew a ring. Holding it up for her to see, he said, "Stella, you've shown me what it means to live after I'd thought I was already living. You make my days brighter and my nights warmer, and you make me happier and more fulfilled than I have ever been in my life. Please, give me the chance to give to you all of the gifts of love and joy that you've given to me. Stella, would you marry me?" Stella's eyes were wide, and in the setting sun he could see the sparkle of her tears. He held his breath, uncertain whether she was sad or happy. But then her smile lit her face and she nodded her head. "Yes." Leonardo threw his arms wide as she launched herself into him, locking lips as they fell backward to the sand. He rolled her under him in the next moment and deepened their kiss until her frenzied energy was gone, and he could feel her body turning supple beneath him. "You're the only one for me," he whispered, brushing her hair away from her cheek. She nodded her head in agreement. "Always and forever." Chapter 17. Leonardo. The sounds of hammers and saws reached Leonardo's ears as he lounged next to the now-completed pool. He was watching Stella pace back and forth as she spoke animatedly into her phone. Her hair was pulled back into a messy bun at the nape of her neck, and she was wearing the gauzy, thin-as-air clothes she liked that outlined with shifting precision the various curves of her body as she moved. She had a new client. The days of working for restoration societies were behind her. Now, she worked directly with the owners of historic properties with a desire to renovate. She assisted in the development of design plans that would provide the best of both worlds. Modern amenities, framed by accurate restoration protecting the original designs of very old architectural structures deemed worth preserving. She helped the owners come up with designs that they loved, but that also met all of the requirements of the complicated preservation laws, and she was loving every second of it. And he was loving every second with her. As if she'd been able to read his thoughts, Stella turned around and gave him a wink. Then, as soon as she ended the call, he patted his thigh, and she joined him by sitting on his lap. Leonardo slid his arms around her. "I'm still amazed at how you saved this place. I thought that everything was lost." She brushed his lips with her own in a soft, tender kiss before snuggling her head on his shoulder. "Not everything," she said, placing her fingers with his. "They'll be here soon. You sure you're ready to tell the others?" He could feel her answering smile on his neck as she brought his hand
to lay over her lower abdomen. I haven't even told Luciana or Adeline. It's been so hard to keep it to myself.
And you're sure that everything is all right? That you're all right?
Stella lifted her head, and he was able to look into her hazel eyes. Everything is all right. I'm sure of it. The doctors are sure of it. Everyone's sure of it. He put the palm of his hand over the scar of her heart.
A baby. His smile grew so big that it hurt his cheeks. Leaning forward, he kissed the flowers that decorated her chest, thankful yet again for the gift of her heart. "Hello!" called Jean-Pierre's voice from some distance away. Leonardo looked down the hill to see his brothers strolling up, their hearts' loves walking with them. Stella laid her palm on Leonardo's cheek, and he gave all of his attention back to her.
I vote that we tell them about the Italian Tourism Board wanting to make a documentary based on the Romano del Mare first. Then we tell them about the baby.
Then you had better talk fast when they get here. All of this love you've created in me has to have somewhere to go, he said, nuzzling her nose with the tip of his own.
Give it to me,
Stella said, leaning in for a kiss that forgot time or place or even the whisper and giggle of soon-to-be in-laws.
Always give it to me.
The end. This has been Italian Billionaire's Determined Lover, the Romano Brothers series, Book 3. Written by Leslie North. Read by Connor Brown. Copyright 2018 by Relay Publishing. Production copyright 2018 by Relay Publishing.